Order, order. Question the President of COP26. I call Fleur Anderson.
Question number 1 to the Minister, please.
Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 1 and 2 together. The Prime Minister's 10-point plan sets out our blueprint for a green industrial revolution, a plan to invest in green technologies and industries, leveraging in billions of pounds of private sector investment, supporting up to 250,000 green jobs and levelling up across the UK. It's a clear plan to build back greener from the COVID pandemic.
I think it's grouped as well. Grouped. 1 and 2's grouped. Yeah. OK. Yeah. Fleur Anderson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK's credibility as COP President rests on demonstrable climate action at home. The government has set legally binding net zero targets, but is currently off track to meet its 4th and 5th carbon budgets, which are calibrated for previous, more lenient targets. Scrapping the Green Homes grant 2 weeks ago puts us into reverse. How will the Secretary of State seek to progress local, national and international progress on energy efficiency and specifically on green homes in the run-up to and during COP26?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I'd say to the Honourable Lady that, of course, the UK has decarbonised its economy faster than any other G20 nation since the year 2000. We've met CB1, CB2, we're on track to meet CB3, and of course, we are pursuing plans to ensure that we meet CB4 and 5. And ahead of COP26, we will publish a comprehensive net zero strategy.
Let's go to Andrew Gwynn. Andrew.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The Secretary of State has talked confidently about British leadership, but the Prime Minister's 10-point plan is full of big words but no real detail, and a total impact by the government's own admission that it will not meet the 4th and 5th carbon budgets. When you pull back the curtain, there's not much to look at and we're running out of time. He's just said in answer to my honourable friend that there will be a net zero strategy. We need it before the summer recess to make the government's word credible ahead of COP26. Does he agree with that? And if so, what's he doing about it?
President Shaw.
Mr. Speaker, as someone who is partly responsible for preparing the 10-point plan, could I suggest he actually read the detail of it? I've also discussed it in terms of the sector-specific points that are in there with individuals within different sectors of industry who have found it quite compelling. Of course, I agree with him that we need to be doing more, and that is why I have committed that we will publish the comprehensive net strategy ahead of COP26.
Let's go to Philip Dunn. Philip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. What steps is my right honourable friend taking in his extensive discussions with leaders around the world in making progress at COP26 to develop a global standard or taxonomy of climate change impact in both financial reporting and in green labelling investment products?
Well, Mr. Speaker, as my honourable friend will know, the UK has taken a leading role in climate-related disclosures by implementing a green taxonomy and, of course, very importantly, making TCFD-aligned disclosures mandatory across the economy by 2025. In the conversations that I have with governments around the world, I'm urging other countries to follow a similar approach on financial disclosures. And when he talks about asset owners in the financial service sector, we're also encouraging asset owners and asset managers to make net zero commitments.
Substantive question to COP President.
Mr. Speaker, when the UK took on the role of the incoming COP26 presidency, under 30% of the global economy was covered by a net zero commitment. The good news is that figure has now increased to 70%, and of course I'm pressing all countries to come forward with net zero commitments. However, as colleagues in this House have acknowledged previously, the UNFCCC's initial NDC synthesis report published in February showed that we have much more progress to make in terms of 2030 emissions reduction targets, and I'm pressing countries on those as well.
Let's go to Ruth Edwards. Ruth.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The UK is a global leader in protecting the ocean, as shown by the success of its Blue Belt and 30 by 30 programmes. But as my right honourable friend will know, only 1% of international waters currently have effective protection. Will he commit the UK to take the lead in pushing for a strong global oceans treaty at the UN to establish an international framework for protecting marine biodiversity in international waters?
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend raises an incredibly vital issue, and so she'll be pleased to hear that the UK is working hard to see negotiations concluded this year on a new UN Convention for the conservation and sustainable use of marine biodiversity in areas beyond national jurisdictions, and this will of course enable the establishment of marine protected areas and help to deliver on that 30 by 30 target.
Shadow Minister Matthew Pennycook.
In a letter to all the UNFCCC parties this week, the President rightly argued that we must halve global emissions by 2030 if we're to keep the goal of limiting global warming to 1.5 degrees within reach. Yet he will know that recent UN analysis makes clear that current national pledges will reduce emissions by just 1% by the end of this critical decade. We need the major emitters to do much more if we're to close the gap. That means deep cuts in American emissions and for Chinese emissions to peak by 2025, but it also means tangible progress on the part of India. With the Prime Minister meeting President Modi later this month, could the COP President tell the House what the UK is willing to put on the table, particularly in terms of climate finance and technological support, to help ensure India feels able to markedly increase its ambition ahead of the summit?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I agree entirely with the honourable gentleman that, of course, all countries need to make much more progress when it comes to ambitious nationally determined contributions. There's 2030 near-term emission reductions targets. I have spoken with large economies around the world. As he knows, I met with President Modi a few weeks ago, and of course, we are working on a number of initiatives with the Indian government. When the Prime Minister does indeed go to India, I'm sure there will be further announcements.
We have another substantive question. President.
Mr. Speaker, we are working very hard to ensure that we deliver an in-person COP which allows all countries to participate on an equal footing. This is incredibly important as many parties feel strongly that negotiations must be in person. We continue to explore how technology and other innovations can make the summit more resilient, safe and inclusive.
Let's go to Martin Day. Martin.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'm grateful for that answer. Many respondents, both academics and former COP attendees to the Beige Committee's survey of expert views, highlighted the important value of remote participation for otherwise excluded groups and for reducing the carbon footprint on the conference. So will the President explore the possibilities of wider virtual participation in COP in addition to the physical attendance at the conference?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman raises an incredibly important point. I've said on a number of occasions that I want this to be the most inclusive COP ever, and absolutely we are looking at how we can expand digital programmes to allow for more virtualisation, and I hope at the appropriate time I'll be able to update the House further.
Darren Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's reported in the papers today that a diplomatic source from the British government says, and I quote, "No one in Europe thinks it's going to happen, and the US is increasingly sceptical it can happen without delay." I support the COP President's aims for a physical conference of national delegations, but of course many stakeholders are politicians, business leaders, NGOs and others. When will the Cabinet Office produce the contingency plans to give clarity to stakeholders about how engagement can take place in November?
Mr. Speaker, the honourable gentleman again raises an incredibly important point. He will have seen the letter I've written to the UNFCCC members as well in terms of progress we want to make over the coming months. I would just say to him that COP26 has already been postponed by 1 year, and the urgency of the climate crisis has not abated. I don't sense any desire amongst parties for a further postponement, and we're working very hard to ensure that we have an in-person physical COP, taking into account, of course, any COVID-related contingencies.
A substantive question. Vice President.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. That's a new title. I was happy with International Champion, but I'm sure Vice Presidency would be acceptable too. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The actions we're taking to tackle climate change support the delivery of a range of the UN Sustainable Development Goals. Through the Together for Our Planet campaign and the Race to Zero, we are encouraging towns, cities and communities to drive climate action at a local level. This is supported by the COP26 UK Mayors and Regional Advisory Council, which includes West Yorkshire Combined Authority and Kirklees Council, and they have set themselves an ambitious target of being net zero by 2038.
Let's go to Barry Sherman. Barry.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. But with the Minister and certainly the Secretary of State, who I have great confidence in, will he ensure that what we're doing in Huddersfield, with making Huddersfield a sustainable town and a sustainable community, by rigorously pursuing the Sustainable Development Goals, we are building a network of towns across the United Kingdom. We're up to about 20. We need to get to 50 and 500. What can the government help us do this? Because it's a one way of grassrooting and making sure that COP26 is not COP-out 26.
I thank the honourable member for his question. I think it's so important that we encourage and indeed provide the tools, and the Together for Our Planet campaign is one of those, to help our constituents, our towns and our cities, to really understand and take charge for themselves of the impact they can have in helping meet our Paris Agreement challenge, and that involves everything from household choices through to changes in how we run our buses and trains, and every council and every community has a role to play in that.
Kim Johnson.
Question number 9, Mr Speaker.
Mr Speaker, I have regular discussions with Cabinet colleagues about decarbonisation. My right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary, is putting a green recovery for transport at the centre of his department's decision-making in the run-up to COP26 and beyond.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you for your answer. Liverpool City Region are developing a project to bring 20 hydrogen-powered double-decker buses to the streets, and the potential for further green investment to scale this up and achieve our ambition of being net zero carbon by 2040. Can the Minister explain when the £30 billion in-planned capital investment as part of the green recovery stimulus will be available to support our ambition? Thank you.
Well, Mr Speaker, I will ensure that the specific point she's raised is taken up with my right honourable friend, the Transport Secretary. What I would say to her is that she will know that last month the Transport Secretary launched a multi-million-pound scheme to enable local authorities to roll out zero-emission buses, and this funding is going to deliver 500 zero-emission buses, supporting the government's wider commitment to introduce 4,000 such vehicles.
Let's go to SNP spokesperson Deirdre Brock. Deirdre.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Mr Speaker, there's no joined-up thinking on any issue with this government, but we would all have hoped for some cross-department thinking on this issue at least. We are, as usual, disappointed with even the Green Homes grant gone after just a few months. So much for building back better. There's increasing concern voiced internationally too about the UK government's lack of progress domestically on environmental commitments. So will he show some real leadership then and commit today to start seriously lobbying his government colleagues to join up the dots and start delivering, so we can look forward to environmentally sound investment, renewed support for a comprehensive charging framework for electric vehicles, real investment in hydrogen technology and marine energy, support for housing improvements and so on? Will he do that, or is he happy to leave us all embarrassed to be hosting COP26 while the UK seems to be striding off in the opposite direction?
Speaker, I'd just say to the Honourable Lady that the role of the COP presidency is to ensure that we are working with all 197 parties to ensure that we are making progress on keeping the 1.5 degrees within reach. Of course, the UK, like any other country, needs to see what more we can do. But I would just say I hope she will acknowledge that we are seen as a leader in the world. And indeed, since 2000, as I said, we've decarbonised our economy faster than any other G20 nation.
Tamanjeet Singh Desi.
Number 11, please, Mr Speaker.
Climate change and biodiversity loss are inextricably linked. That's why the UK has made nature a core priority of our COP26 presidency. We pioneered and launched the Leaders' Pledge for Nature in September last year, and we are also driving global action to protect and restore critical ecosystems like forests and accelerating a transition towards sustainable agriculture, whilst mobilising the finance to support this.
Speaker, in order to tackle biodiversity loss, the Convention on Biological Diversity, COP15 in May, will support new targets on nature. However, with the environmental bill delayed yet again, how will the Minister ensure that the outcomes from this conference will feed into the COP26 in November this year?
The Prime Minister and President Xi have agreed that the UK and China should work together as respective hosts of the UNFCCC COP26 and CBD COP15 to reinforce and amplify those linkages between climate change and biodiversity loss and to achieve mutually supportive and ambitious outcomes at both summits. So we're working closely with our Chinese counterparts and with the UN Secretariats of the UNFCCC, the CBD and the CCD conventions to strengthen those links between these conventions to deliver the best outcomes for nature.
Virginia Crosby.
Question 12, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I've so far engaged with ministers and negotiators from over 80 countries and briefed all parties through the UN on a number of occasions. This, of course, includes discussions with representatives of countries including China, the US, the EU and India.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I thank the Secretary of State for his answer. In light of Germany's Coal Phase-Out Act, which states it will not end the use of coal-powered energy until 2038, how does the Minister intend to use COP26 to promote nuclear power, in particular at key UK sites like Wilvernerith on Anglesey, in order to meet the UK's net zero targets?
President.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is of course a consistent and strong champion of both the nuclear sector and the Wilfer site in her constituency, and of course I commend her zeal. But as I've said to her previously, nuclear power is clearly has a role to play in our clean energy mix as we work towards net zero emissions by 2050, and she will know in the 10-point plan the Prime Minister set out, we are backing large nuclear as well as SMRs and AMRs.
Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I have engaged with hundreds of global and UK businesses through a combination of speaking at high-profile events and bilateral meetings, as well as through my COP26 Business Leaders Advisory Group. Businesses have a key role to play in tackling climate change, and I encourage them all to sign up to the Race to Zero campaign.
Well, Fletcher.
For that answer. Derbyshire County Council recently launched a £2 million Green Entrepreneurs Fund for businesses that are interested in green energy and carbon reduction. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that this is an excellent example of local government and businesses working together, and will he share my praise for the County Council leader, Barry Lewis, for his visionary leadership on this issue?
Speaker, I commend both my honourable friend and, of course, the leader of Derbyshire County Council, Barry Lewis, for championing this excellent initiative. And this is precisely the type of scheme we want to see, supporting businesses, supporting growth and jobs whilst cutting emissions.
David Johnson.
Question 14, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, with your permission, I will answer questions 14, 15 and 16 together. I want COP26 to be the most inclusive ever, and the voices of young people are vital to this process. That is why I've set up an international COP26 Civil Society and Youth Advisory Council, allowing for a regular dialogue with youth activists, NGOs, Indigenous peoples and faith groups as we plan for COP26.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I have a pile of letters on my desk from children at Gems Didcot and John Blandy primary schools who've written to me to tell me what they've learnt about climate change, what positive changes they saw in the environment during lockdown, and to give me their ideas of things they think the government should be doing. Can my right honourable friend tell me how children and young people will be able to feed into the preparations for COP26?
President.
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for championing the views of young people in his constituency, and of course I pay tribute to the pupils at John Blandy and Gems Didcot primary schools for their enthusiasm for climate action. I'll be delighted to receive their letters, review their ideas, and through him I will respond in writing to his constituents.
Let's go to Laura Farris. Laura.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. My right honourable friend and I both have the privilege of representing seats in Berkshire, where many young people are passionate about climate change and are active in local groups like the West Berkshire Climate Action Network. This is their first real opportunity to see UK leadership in action. Could my right honourable friend confirm to me how they can access the Youth Council that he just described and other mechanisms to feed their ideas into the COP later this year?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I thank my honourable friend for the work that she also does in promoting climate action. I'd be very happy to hear from young people and youth groups in her constituency. What I can tell her, though, is that we will be engaging further with schools in relation to COP26 to unleash the enthusiasm and energy of young people across the UK to tackle climate change.
Susan Webb.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. We all have a stake in protecting our climate, particularly young adults in my constituency, who I hope will be the pioneers of change. As part of the UK-Italy COP26 partnership, what are the plans for the Youth for Climate 2021 Driving Ambition event to be held in Milan in September?
Mr. Speaker, from the 28th to the 30th September, the Youth for Climate event will bring together 400 youth delegates from across the globe to discuss topics under a range of thematic areas, and the event will culminate in a declaration and discussion between the youth delegates and ministers attending the pre-COP26 event.
We now come to topicals for the COP President.
Mr. Speaker, if we are to protect our planet from the ravages of climate change, we must support developing countries to respond. But without adequate finance, the task ahead is well nigh impossible. That is why on the 31st of March, the UK presidency convened around 50 developing and donor countries and multilateral institutions to consider how we can get more and more timely public finance flowing to climate action. I'm very pleased that we've secured a range of commitments from the likes of the World Bank, the IMF and donor countries to move this vital work forward. It is our moral duty, Mr. Speaker, to protect the most vulnerable communities from a climate crisis that they have not caused.
Let's go to Debbie Abrahams. Debbie.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, how does supporting a new Cumbrian coal mine, giving new licences for oil and gas exploration, scrapping the Greenhouse Homes grant and reducing incentives for electric vehicles reflect the government's stated commitment to reach net zero carbon emissions by 2050? Or is this more dad-dancing rhetoric by the Prime Minister, unconvincing and uncoordinated?
Mr. Speaker, the Honourable Lady raised a number of points. I think in previous answers I have set out the ambition that the UK has and the progress that we've made, but specifically when it comes to oil and gas licensing, the UK government is going to be introducing a new climate compatibility checkpoint before each future oil and gas licensing round to ensure that licences awarded are aligned with wider climate objectives, including net zero emissions by 2050.
Go to Shirley McCauley. Shirley.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Surfers Against Sewage in my constituency are ardent environmental campaigners, particularly on plastic pollution and water quality, and our environment is all the better for their work. The government has a key role to play on protecting the environment. So can my right honourable friend assure me that when the world gathers for COP26 in November, protecting and enhancing the environment, particularly for the people of Cornwall, is at the very top of their agenda?
Mr. Speaker, the COP26 Nature Campaign is driving ambitious international and domestic action to protect and enhance our environment, and this will be a high priority at COP26 in November. I commend the work that Surfers Against Sewage are doing on water pollution and water quality, which I hope to see firsthand when I visit Cornwall as part of the G7 summit in June. Protecting the ocean, including through nature-based solutions, provides multiple vitally important climate change adaptation and resilience benefits.
Secretary Edmund.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Last month, the COP president wrote that the world is, and I quote, doing nowhere near enough to limit global warming to 1.5 degrees, and he's right. Now, a green economic stimulus could make a huge difference to meeting the target. But while we have put it as the top item on the G7 agenda, the sum total of the Chancellor's measures here in the UK promised just 12 billion of green spending over a decade, and he's already cut £1 billion from that. Our investment is 60 times smaller than President Biden's green infrastructure plan. Isn't it a very significant challenge for COP26 that when it comes to a green stimulus, we're telling others to act, but not doing so ourselves?
Well, Mr. Speaker, the Right Honourable Gentleman knows that we agree on many of these issues in terms of tackling climate change. But what I would say to him is that when it comes to government money, what we've also done is ensured that we leverage in private sector money. This isn't just about government money, it is also leveraging private sector money. And ultimately, this is about not just cutting emissions, but also creating jobs for constituents across the UK.
He will know, as COP26 hosts, our actions face particular scrutiny, and I think he will know the international community is increasingly concerned, and not just on green recovery. The government calls on others to power past coal, but flirts with a new coal mine. It says to others adopt a net zero target, but is off track on ours. And it tells countries to support the world's poorest, but slashes aid spending. Rachel Kite, former Special Representative of the UN Secretary General, said this week about our record on climate, what the UK is doing is like dad dancing. They are very uncoordinated. Isn't it time the government gave up the dad dancing on climate and showed some consistent leadership?
Well, Mr. Speaker, I know he himself is obviously a very good dancer and therefore is unlikely to take part in dad dancing. We should try it together at some point. Can I just say to him? Can I just say to him that, of course, every country, including the UK, needs to make more progress in terms of cutting emissions. He makes specific reference to coal. He will know that our energy mix when it comes to coal has gone from 40% in 2012 to less than 2% last year. And we have been leading the Powering Past Coal Alliance, where a large number of countries have now signed up. So we are making progress. Of course, there is more that we can do.
We now come to Stephen Metcalfe.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can my right honourable friend tell the House what diplomatic steps he has taken to engage with international partners on preparation for COP26?
Mr. Speaker, we're working closely at many levels with international partners on preparations for COP26 and to accelerate climate ambition. The COP President-designate has met large numbers of governments. He is already out and about visiting many countries, 15 in the last few weeks, and briefing UN member states on a regular basis. And I am working with the most vulnerable countries to make sure that they are supported for their ambitions to meet their resilience challenges.
We have the final question from Hilary Byrne. Hilary.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. Converting UK homes to zero carbon heating will be a huge task. Does the COP President believe that heat pumps can adequately replace all gas boilers? And if there's a need for supplementary heating, what form does he think this should take?
Mr. Speaker, I refer the right honourable gentleman to the 10-point plan, which set out very clearly the progress that we want to make in terms of decarbonising buildings and homes as well. And of course, heat pumps will play a part. We've also set out in there our plans in terms of the use of hydrogen for home heating as well.
We now come to questions to the Prime Minister. And we start with Gagan Mahendra. Gagan.
Number one, Mr. Speaker.
Mr. Speaker, I know colleagues across the House will wish to join me in paying tribute to our dear friend and colleague, Dame Cheryl Gillan, who sadly died last week. An MP for Chesham and Amersham for 29 years, she will be remembered for being a strong voice for her constituents, a brilliant campaigner, including her advocacy for autistic people and their families, and for being the first female Secretary of State for Wales. I also want to pay tribute to Baroness Shirley Williams, a pioneer for women in politics and in government, and to our former colleague Peter Ainsworth, who was passionate about his causes, especially the environment. Mr. Speaker, this morning I had meetings with ministerial colleagues and others. In addition to my duties in this House, I shall have further such meetings later today.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Dame Cheryl represented her constituents with considerable effectiveness for nearly 29 years and is already sorely missed in this place, especially by many of the newer members, as she was so kind to us in our first months in this place. One of her passions was the protection of chalk streams, in particular the River Chess, which passes through my constituency of South West Hertfordshire. Many MPs are increasingly concerned about reports of partially treated sewage being released into our rivers, with knock-on health impacts for both humans and animals. Can my right honourable friend reassure this House that this government will actively protect our rivers and streams?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, my honourable friend is entirely right to raise the concern that we fully share about sewage overflow from into rivers such as the Chess, and that's why we have set up the Storm Overflows Task Force to address the matter, working with the water industry regulators and environmental groups. And last month we announced legislation, plans for legislation to address this very issue.
Now come to the Leader of the Opposition, Right Honourable Keir Starmer.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Can I join the Prime Minister in his remarks about Dame Cheryl Gillan, who I work with on a cross-party basis and remember with fondness, and Ian Gibson, who also passed away this week. Both commanded respect on all sides of this House and will be sadly missed. Can I also pay tribute to Shirley Williams? She was a great parliamentarian, a formidable minister and cabinet minister. She loved this House, the other place, and frankly anywhere where she could debate ideas and politics. For many years she was Labour's loss. Today she is Britain's loss, and my thoughts are with her family and loved ones. Mr. Speaker, does the Prime Minister believe that the current lobbying rules are fit for purpose?
Mr. Speaker, I join the right honourable gentleman in what he said about Ian Gibson, and I indeed share the widespread concern about some of the stuff that we're reading at the moment, Mr. Speaker, and I know that the Cabinet Secretary shares my concern as well. I do think it is a good idea in principle that top civil servants should be able to engage with business and should have experience of the private sector. When I look at the accounts I'm reading today, it's not clear that those boundaries have been properly understood, and I've asked for a proper independent review of the arrangements that we have to be conducted by Nigel Boardman, and he will be reporting in June. And if he has any representations he wishes to make on that subject, he should do so to Mr. Boardman.
Mr. Speaker, I know the Prime Minister is launching an inquiry. That inquiry isn't even looking at the lobbying rules. I'm not sure it's looking at very much at all, because every day there's further evidence of the sleaze that's now at the heart of this Conservative government. Let's just look, shake your heads, let's just look at the latest scandal. A wealthy businessman, Lex Greensill, was hired as a senior advisor to David Cameron when he was Prime Minister. We've all seen the business card. After he left office, Cameron, became a paid lobbyist for Lex Greensill. Next thing we know, Cameron arranged access for Greensill with cabinet ministers and senior officials, and he lobbied for taxpayers' money on behalf of Greensill Capital. We also know the Chancellor pushed officials. We know the Health Secretary met Cameron and Greensill. We know that senior officials met Greensill Capital regularly. And now, even more unbelievably, we know the government's former head of procurement, no less, became a Greensill advisor while he was still a civil servant. Does the Prime Minister accept there's a revolving door, indeed an open door, between his Conservative government and paid lobbyists?
Mr. Speaker, this is a government and a party that has been consistently tough on lobbying, and indeed we introduced legislation saying that there should be no taxpayer-funded lobbying, that quangos should not be used to get involved with lobbying. We put in a register for lobbyists, and there's one party, Mr. Speaker, that actually voted to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act, and that was the Labour Party in their historic 2019 election manifesto, which he is yet to repudiate, Mr. Speaker. They did so because they thought it was unfair and was restricting people's ability to make representations to politicians. I think that's absurd. Will he now say that it's absurd to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act?
Mr. Speaker, he talks of the Lobbying Act. Who was it who introduced that legislation? David Cameron. Who was it who voted for the legislation? Half the Conservative front bench. We said it wouldn't be tough enough. And where did that legislation lead? 2 years later, David Cameron camping out in a Saudi desert with Lex Greensill having a cup of tea. I rest my case in relation to that legislation. Let me try another very simple question. Is the Prime Minister aware of any other government official who had commercial links with Greensill or any other lobbying role while working in government?
Mr. Speaker, if he has any such information, he should, of course, make it available to Mr. Boardman. That's the point of his. That's the point of his review. It's an independent review. It'll be coming to me by June. I'll be glad it will be played in the library of the House of Commons. I talk about lobbying, Mr. Speaker. He's being advised by Lord Mandelson of Global Counsel Limited. Perhaps in the interests of full transparency, so we can know where he's coming from, Lord Mandelson could be encouraged to disclose his other clients, Mr. Speaker.
Keir Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, I haven't heard a defence that ridiculous since my last days in the Crown Court. It's called the shoplifter's defence. Everyone else is nicking stuff, so why can't I? Mr. Speaker, it never worked. I remind the Prime Minister, I not only prosecuted shoplifters, I prosecuted MPs over the MPs' expenses scandal. So I stand on my record. That line just isn't going to wash with me. It was a former Prime Minister, and I suspect now former lobbyist, who once said, "This isn't a minor issue with minor consequences. Government contracts potentially worth hundreds of billions of pounds are at stake." So can the Prime Minister now answer the question the Chancellor's been ducking for weeks? How was it that Greensill Capital, a company employing David Cameron, got the green light to give hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayer-backed loans?
Mr. Speaker, whilst he was prosecuting MPs, I was cutting crime in London by 23% and cutting the murder rate by 50%. And he asks about lobbying on behalf of Greensill. Mr. Speaker, and again, I don't wish to embarrass the right honourable gentleman, but he doesn't have far to look. There was one person asking for the Greensill Bank to be able to use the coronavirus business interruption loan scheme, and that was the Shadow Defence Secretary, Mr. Speaker.
It gets weaker and weaker. It does take me back to my defence days in the Crown Court. It's just ridiculous. The Shadow Defence Secretary. It really wasn't a good point. If you think that's a good point, you've got real problems. Shadow Defence Secretary was speaking for his constituents and for local jobs. That is million miles away from being a paid lobbyist texting friends in government. The Prime Minister says there's going to be an inquiry, but the person he's appointed worked for the same law firm which lobbied to loosen lobbying laws. You couldn't make it up. What we need is to overhaul the whole broken system. This afternoon, Labour's motion calls for a proper parliamentary inquiry into this scandal. If the Prime Minister is so concerned about this, he should welcome the motion. After all, to quote David Cameron, his old school friend, sunlight is the best disinfectant. So will the Prime Minister vote with Labour today for a full, transparent, independent inquiry?
Mr. Speaker, I think he would have been better off supporting the Lobbying Act, and the Labour Party would have been better off not campaigning to get rid of it. It toughens up our laws, and Mr. Speaker, I think that his own proposal is simply to have, yet again, to have politicians marking their own homework. What the country wants, that's all it is. A committee of MPs to look at it. It won't do a blind bit of good. That's why we're having a proper independent review. If he has any representations or allegations to make about what has taken place, he should make them to the eminent lawyer who's been asked to do it, who'll be reporting to us by June.
Yes, Starmer.
Mr. Speaker, the Prime Minister should be voting with us, not blocking a proper inquiry. The Greensill scandal is just the tip of the iceberg. Dodgy contracts, privileged access, jobs for their mates. This is the return of Tory sleaze. Mr. Speaker, it's now so ingrained in this Conservative government, we don't need another Conservative Party appointee marking their own homework. Actually, Mr. Speaker, the more I listen to the Prime Minister, the more I think that Ted Hastings and AC12 are needed to get to the bottom of this one. Mr. Speaker, we know the Prime Minister will not act against sleaze, but this House can. So can I urge all members of this House to come together this afternoon to back Labour's motion and start to clean up the sleaze and cronyism that's at the heart of this Conservative government?
Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, that's why we're putting in an independent review. That's why we have tougher laws on lobbying. A great shame that Labour opposed them. Mr. Speaker, yes, we are getting on with rooting out bent coppers, Mr. Speaker. We're also appointing and hiring thousands more police officers. Mr. Speaker, we're fighting crime. We're fighting crime on the streets of our cities, whilst they opposed the police and crime bill, which would have put in tougher sentences for serious sexual and violent offenders, absolutely, and they then encouraged people who went out and demonstrated, Mr. Speaker, to kill the bill. We're getting on with protecting the public. That's absolutely correct, Mr. Speaker. We're getting on with protecting the public of this country from crime of all kinds. We're getting on with the job of running this country, of rolling out a vaccination programme.
Order. Prime Minister, I think we ought to at least try and address the question. Dean Russell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's been a year this week since I had the privilege of starting to volunteer at Watford General Hospital, and over this time I've been fortunate and privileged to work along some inspirational and selfless volunteers. So as the nation reflects this week on the importance of schemes to support young people, may I ask the Prime Minister if he would meet with me to explore the creation of an NHS cadet scheme to pay tribute to those who've already volunteered over the past year and also create a lasting legacy for generations to come. Thank you.
Yes, indeed. Thank you. I thank my honourable friend for what he's doing. I thank everybody at Watford General Hospital for the support they've given throughout the pandemic, and particularly, Mr. Speaker, the volunteers who play a massive part in our vaccination rollout programme. And I fully support the NHS cadet scheme, part of our work to establish a volunteering legacy for young people from the pandemic.
Leader of the SNP, Ian Blackford.
Morning time, Mr. Speaker. Can I associate myself with the remarks of the Prime Minister and the Leader of the Opposition on Dame Cheryl Gillan and of Shirley Williams? Mr. Speaker, the Scottish Government has passed landmark legislation embedding the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child into Scots law. A real revolution in children's rights. Every party in the Scottish Parliament supported it, even the Scots Tories. It has been welcomed everywhere, except here in Westminster. Instead of supporting this new law, the UK Government is shamefully taking the Scottish Parliament to court in order to strike it down. Apparently, the only basis of the UK Government's legal case is that the law constrains Westminster powers. So, Prime Minister, can you do everyone a favour by explaining how protecting children's rights in Scotland threatens the Tory government in London?
Mr. Speaker, this is complete nonsense. The government of the United Kingdom ratified the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child 30 years ago. We all support it. It is nothing to do with the rights of vulnerable children, which we all protect. This is simply an attempt by the SNP to stir up constitutional chaos and create another fictitious bone of contention between themselves and the rest of the country. If they really cared about the rights of the child, Mr. Speaker, they would do much more to improve education in Scotland, where they are so lamentably failing, Mr. Speaker.
Ian Blackford.
The rights of the child, an act passed by the Scottish Parliament, supported by every party, and his government is taking our Parliament, our government, to court. Mr. Speaker, there's nothing technical about this, and the Westminster government wants to strip away the rights of children in Scotland. This is a tale of two governments. We have an SNP Scottish Government delivering the baby box, doubling the Scottish child payment and providing free school meals to every primary school child. At the same time, this Tory government is robbing children of their rights in Scotland. Quite simply, Mr. Speaker, the SNP Scottish Government has and will continue to work to ensure Scotland is the best place for a child to grow up. This legal challenge threatens that. It is wrong and it is morally repugnant, Prime Minister. Will the Prime Minister commit to withdrawing his legal challenge today? If not, we'll see you in court.
Well, Mr. Speaker, the best thing they can do, as I say, for the rights of the child in Scotland is to improve their shameful record on education and to tackle the issues that matter to the people of Scotland, to tackle the tax regime that they put in place, to do better on fighting crime and drug addiction in Scotland. They should be looking at the issues that really matter, in my view, to the people of Scotland. And instead, they're going into the elections next month, Mr. Speaker, yet again on a campaign to break up this country. That's all they can think of. Break up this country, call for a referendum, break up this country, destroy our country, and call a referendum in a way that I think is completely irresponsible at a very difficult time when we want to bounce back stronger together.
David Jones.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The A55 expressway is of huge importance to North Wales, linking the region to the main motorway network. It is also, as was noted in the recent interim report on the Union Connectivity Review, the principal freight artery for the port of Holyhead. The road is in desperate need of improvement and has been for many years. So will my right honourable friend confirm that the government will make it a priority to use its powers under the UK Internal Market Act to upgrade the road for the benefit of the people of North Wales?
Thank you. I thank my right honourable friend. He's completely right, and the Sir Peter Hendy has rightly identified the potential of the A55, and I think the best thing the people of Wales can do to guarantee these vital upgrades is to elect a Welsh Conservative government on May the 6th.
We now go to Vicky Foxcroft. Vicky, I understand you're going to sign. Can you speak and sign at the same time for all our benefits? Vicky Foxcroft.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And if the Prime Minister doesn't understand, imagine how those who rely on British Sign Language feel at his press briefings. 2.6 million spent on the new press room, yet still no interpreter. What message does he think this sends to disabled people?
I'm grateful to the honourable lady and grateful for the way she has set out her question. I will revert to her as soon as I can.
Sarah Dines.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Does my right honourable friend agree with me that it is thanks to the sacrifice of the British people during lockdown and the great success of the vaccination programme that lots of small businesses across the whole country and in my constituency in Derbyshire Dales, like Brocklehurst, who supplied clothing to the Duke of Prince Philip, that they can remain open? Will he join with me in a campaign to shop local as we come out of lockdown?
I thank my honourable friend, and I can tell her that, yes, I certainly will encourage her and everybody else to shop local as we come out of lockdown, and as I very much hope that we will be able to do. And my right honourable friend, the Communities Secretary, has announced £830 million of funding from the Future High Streets Fund has been allocated to areas, including her own, in order to encourage that shopping that we all hope and want to see.
Ruth Catherine.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. May I extend my condolences and those of my constituents to the Queen and to the royal family for their sad loss, and also to the families and colleagues of Cheryl Gillam and Shirley Williams. Will the Prime Minister tell this House when he last spoke to former Prime Minister David Cameron?
Prime Minister.
The honest truth, I cannot remember when I last spoke to Dave, but I can, if she wants to know whether I've had any contact with him about any of the matters that have been in the press, the answer is no.
Father of the House, St Peter Bottom.
Mr. Speaker, those who helped to develop, to test, to approve and manufacture the vaccines deserve our praise. Will my right honourable friend also recognise that the successful rollout of the vaccination programme has been based on the dedication of the NHS staff and the myriads of volunteers who made the process so easy for so many people?
My right honourable friend is completely right. This has been a colossal team effort. It has been led by the NHS with GPs very often doing the lion's share of the work, but they've been supported by the Army, by local council officials who have also been absolutely magnificent, and as colleagues have said earlier, by volunteers as well.
16 withdrawn, so we go to Dr. James Davies.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. The interim findings of Sir Peter Hendy's Union Connectivity Review are very much to be welcomed. He highlights the improvements that need to be made to the railways in North Wales linking up with Merseyside and Manchester, as well as the A55. These, of course, can help to level up the region. Will my right honourable friend confirm that the identified projects within Sir Peter Hendy's work in North Wales will receive a fair chunk of the £20 million of development funding as part of the agenda? And will he commit to implementing the findings of Sir Peter Hendy's final report when it's released in the summer?
I thank my honourable friend. We will look at what Sir Peter has to say. I think he's come up with some very interesting interim proposals, particularly about improving connectivity along the North Wales coastline, the routes into Merseyside, and on the A55. I repeat what I said to my right honourable friend earlier on. There is a great opportunity to do that if people will vote Conservative and vote for a Welsh Conservative government on May the 6th, Mr. Speaker.
Let's go to Howell Williams. Howell.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In 2007, my friend Adam Price, then the member for Carmarthen East and Dynevor, proposed an elected representatives prohibition of deception bill. At this distance in time, it would be, well, unkind to quiz the Prime Minister on the detail, because he is seen as a big thinker. So today, perhaps he could tell the House what he thinks of the principle of that bill, which is that on important matters of public policy, politicians must not lie.
Well, I certainly agree. I have a high regard for the honourable gentleman, and indeed, I remember happy times with his colleague Adam Price. I don't remember the details of his bill, but I think, Mr. Speaker, we will all concur with the basic principle that he's just enunciated.
Esther Backbay.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Former Police Inspector Kash Singh set up One Britain, One Nation, otherwise known as OBON, to bring together all communities, all classes, all ethnicities, races and religions to celebrate being British. OBON Day is held in June. However, next week, on April the 22nd, will be the launch of it at a school in Bradford. Will the Prime Minister join me in congratulating Kash Singh for his fantastic initiative for all communities to come together in a common pride of being British? And will he also make a message for the launch next week?
When I say yes, I'll do my best, Mr. Speaker. But I fully support what she's doing, and I congratulate Kash Singh on his work. And it is incredible at this time, Mr. Speaker, there are people who want to split our country up rather than bring us together. That's what they want to do. I think it's an absolute tragedy that they still think like that. I think they're going to change, Mr. Speaker. But I wish everybody at OBON all the very best.
Kim Johnson.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And contrary to the conclusions of the Race and Ethnic Disparity Report, institutional racism still exists. And 40 years since the Liverpool 8 uprisings, black communities continue to suffer racial injustice. And the report downplays the structural inequalities that still exist. The Resolution Foundation announced today that unemployment rate for young black people rose by 35% compared to 13% for their white counterparts. Can the Prime Minister confirm the allegations that Downing Street redrafted the report to change the narrative? And does he agree with me that this report should now be withdrawn? Thank you.
Well, I thank the honourable lady, but actually, when you look at the report and read it in detail, there's not everything that this government is going to agree with. Of course not. There is some interesting observations, some interesting ways of looking at things, and we will be responding in due course. But what we say is that nobody should be in any doubt as to the reality of racism, to the reality of the struggle that too many people face, and we are going to do everything we can to stamp it out, and particularly to help young black people get the jobs, get the education that they need.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. As my right honourable friend will know, as we build back better, we need to inspire the next generation of scientists and engineers. Will he therefore agree to work with Engineering UK and Big Bang Digital to provide a short online introduction to this year's event to reinforce the message that a career in engineering is rewarding, it's creative and can transform the world around us for the better? And will he recognise the extraordinary contribution engineers have made and are making in our battle against COVID?
I thank my friend, because engineers have obviously been crucial, and scientists of all kind, in the fight against COVID. And this is the moment, Mr. Speaker, to become an engineer, or to work towards being an engineer. We're putting a huge £640 billion investment into the infrastructure of this country over the next few years. We're going to need skilled young people to be going into engineering. That's why we put in the T-levels. I congratulate my honourable friend on his initiative. I will do my best to support him.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Given his ancestry, the Prime Minister will be more than familiar with the phrase, "a fish rots from the head down." It is a Turkish proverb. Put simply, since he became the Prime Minister, the sound of Big Ben's bungs has been replaced by the cash-till sound of big donor bungs. There's been a threefold increase in bungs from property developers. Last summer, we had the case of Richard Desmond and the Community Secretary. More recently, we've had ministers dishing the dosh between constituencies, and a health secretary handing or involved in a contract with his pub landlord for £30 million worth of PPE. Now we have a chancellor and health secretary that have sought to grease the wheels of involvement with Greensill and David Cameron. What does this say about the Prime Minister's leadership of his government?
Mr. Speaker, I'm afraid he is simply wrong in what he says, and particularly about what he says about the Chancellor, my honourable friend, the Chancellor, and the Health Secretary. And I don't believe that he should have spoken in those terms, Mr. Speaker. But what I will say is that there is one party in this place that brought in tough rules on lobbying, and there's another party that campaigned at the last election to get rid of those rules because of their relationship with the trades unions, Mr. Speaker, because they wanted them to continue in the obscure, opaque way that they were being run, and because they wanted people to be able to continue to lobby parliamentarians in the way that they always did. And look at their Labour manifesto of 2019, Mr. Speaker. If he repudiates it now, why don't go ahead and do so?
Final question from Gareth Davis.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Over the last few months, a number of my constituents have taken to the streets to help tackle the problem of littering, and I pay particular tribute to those constituents in Colsterworth who I met with recently. Will the Prime Minister join me in backing the Grantham Journal's Spring Clean campaign, and can he assure my constituents the government are doing all it can to help tackle littering?
Prime Minister.
I share, Mr. Speaker, his indignation about litter, and I do think it's one of the things on which the whole of the country, and I hope the whole of the House, is united. That's why we're doing the Respect the Outdoors campaign to encourage people to follow the countryside code, to pick up their litter. Obviously, a lot of people are meeting outdoors at the moment, Mr. Speaker, because of the pandemic. They must obey the basic laws of respect for other people, pick up their litter. We're putting money into new litter bins, and yes, Mr. Speaker, we are increasing fines on the spot, fines for littering. I know that there will be many libertarians in this place who think that's unfair and draconian. Personally, Mr. Speaker, I think it's the right thing to do. I abhor litter, and I urge anybody who sees anybody throwing away a crisp packet to tick them off and tell them to pick it up, Mr. Speaker.
I am now suspending the House for 3 minutes to enable necessary arrangements to be made for the next business order. We now come to the 10-minute rule motion. Carolyn Harris.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I beg to move that leave be given to bring in a bill to require the Secretary of State to lay before Parliament a report on proposal to award NHS staff a pay rise for 2021-2022 below 2.1%. To require the Secretary of State to move a House of Commons motion to approve any such report and for connected purposes. The last 13 months have impacted all of our lives. Illness, bereavement and financial worries, on top of learning to live with the fear of the pandemic and the limits on our freedoms. We haven't all faced the same level of difficulties, but none of us have escaped without our lives in some way being changed by the experience. 127,000 people have tragically lost their lives, one of the highest death tolls in Europe. And in the past year, over 450,000 have been hospitalised due to severe COVID symptoms. For every one of those people, it has been our amazing NHS frontline staff that have cared for them, fought for them, and either celebrated their recovery or held their hands as they took their last breath. Our NHS staff have kept this country going, risking their own health, isolating from their own families, working harder than ever, grieving the lives that they couldn't save, and comforting the bereaved. They are the very best of Britain, and they deserve to be given the credit and the reward for everything that they have done and everything they have sacrificed to keep the rest of us safe. Nurses and NHS staff were promised at least a 2.1% pay rise, but the government has now retracted that and recommended 1% for all NHS staff, with the exception of junior doctors, GPs and dentists. The government pretend this is a rise. They're fooling no one. With inflation forecast to reach 1.7% this year, our NHS staff will have shown nothing but commitment this last year, are now set to receive a real-term pay cut. Nurses' pay have been falling in real terms since the Conservatives came to power 11 years ago, with pay awards consistently lagging behind inflation. Already this is unacceptable, but in the current situation, the government's proposal to reduce this even further shows a complete lack of respect and gratitude. For me, the thought of looking a nurse in the eye and telling them that they are worth less this year than they were before the pandemic is outrageously insulting. All of us across this House stood on our doorsteps and clapped for key workers. We all took to social media and thanked NHS staff and tell them what a wonderful job they were doing. We would all have been indebted to them if we got sick and needed hospital care against this undiscriminating virus. In fact, some on these benches did. So it was just for show? Were the worm wards and platitudes just a tick-box exercise? Or does the Prime Minister and his government, hand on heart, truly believe a rule-breaking, unapologetic aid is worth considerably more than the hundreds of thousands of NHS staff who have worked tirelessly and selflessly to battle this viral enemy and save lives? That promise was clear. 2.1% increase as a minimum, not dependent on inflation rates or any other economic struggles. And that promise has been broken in yet another ill-judged U-turn by the government. If the Prime Minister and his Cabinet colleagues have now rescinded that offer and replaced it with an inferior one, then they need to come to this House with a revised recommendation and put it to a vote. When members on this side of the House clapped on a Thursday evening and pledged our support to the NHS heroes, we meant it, and we still mean it. They have held up their side of the bargain, working diligently and doing everything in their power to save lives. Now it's our turn to hold up ours by voting in favour of a fair, long-term pay deal that reflects their commitment. A recent survey by the Royal College of Nurses concluded that more than a third of the 42,000 who submitted responses were considering leaving the NHS because they felt undervalued. These are staff who are exhausted from their efforts over the last year. They've worked unpaid overtime. They forfeited their own mental well-being, and they far too often put our families ahead of their own. The least they expected in return was recognition and fairness. But for a government that has consistently failed to deliver on both, it appears that they were expecting too much. We're on a cliff edge here. We know already that we entered the pandemic with a record 100,000 vacancies across the NHS. If we don't pay the staff what they deserve, then we will struggle to retain those that we have, let alone fill any vacancies. Even the 2.1 in the long-term plan was a minimum, and a cautious one at that. 1% is not a pay rise, it's an insult. Trade unions and professional bodies are calling for improved pay offers at varying levels. They know a fair pay rise would also help boost staff recruitment and retention. A 1% pay rise for an experienced nurse equates to £3.50 a week. £3.50 for a year of unpaid overtime, unwavering commitment and personal sacrifice. £3.50 for a year of turmoil, of fighting a virus that at times seemed unbeatable, of watching patients die despite doing everything they could to save them, of having to keep on going when they were beyond exhausted. On this side of the House, we believe our NHS are worth so much more. With this bill, the government will be required to present their recommendations for anything below the already proved minimum increase of 2.1 and seek agreement from the House of any new proposals. That is the least our NHS deserves. Our NHS staff have not faltered since the start of the pandemic, and they deserve to be rewarded for that. Unions and stakeholders know it, the public know it, and we on this side of the House know it. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
That the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. The question is that the honourable member have leave to bring in the bill. As many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no.
No! 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 No!
I think we're now getting a bit more to it. Right, let's lock the doors. Division. The question is, as on the order paper, as many of that opinion say aye. Aye. The contrary, no.
No, no.
Tellers for the ayes, Colleen Fletcher and Jill Furness. For the noes, Mark Tommy and Jessica Morden. Lock the doors. Order. The ayes. Oops, sorry.
Ayes to the right, 222. The noes to the left, 0.
The ayes to the right, 222. The noes to the left, 0. The ayes have it. The ayes have it. Unlock. Who will prepare to bring in the bill?
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Keir Starmer, Angela Rayner, Jonathan Ashworth, Dr Rosanna Allen-Khan, Mr Nicholas Brown, Liz Kendall, Justin Madders, Alex Norris, Jim Shannon, Jamie Stone and myself, Mr Speaker.
Harris.
NHS Pay Award Report Bill.
Second reading what day?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow. Thank you. We now come to the first Opposition Day motion on committee to investigate the lobbying of government. I call Rachel Reeves to move the motion. Shadow Secretary of State.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisers for sale, helping business find the right way to get its way. This is how former Conservative Prime Minister David Cameron described the next big scandal to hit British politics. That was back in 2010. You might think that what David Cameron lacks in transparency, he makes up for in fortune-telling. Except that he had inside information, because the person exploiting the loopholes would be the very same David Cameron. We have a Conservative Prime Minister giving Lex Greensill access to all areas of government. He was brought in and given privileged access to the heart of government with the title and the business card as a senior advisor in the Prime Minister's office. And then, what a stroke of luck. When he was no longer Prime Minister, and just past the period where he no longer needed approval of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, David Cameron joins Greensill to lobby the Conservative government full of his friends. Having refused to respond to any questions at all for 40 days, David Cameron chose a period of national grief, hoping that there would be less political criticism and less scrutiny. Mr Speaker, it is cynical and it is shabby. And the statement itself, it was toe-curling. He's not sorry for his conduct, for the texts and the drinks, but he is sorry he got caught, and he's sorry that his shares are now worthless. This isn't just a question of why he didn't go through the correct channels, but it's a question of why he was doing this at all. So let's be really clear. David Cameron was not working in the national interest, but in his own personal interest, with the hope of making millions of pounds for himself through the exercise of his share options. But questions cannot just be asked of David Cameron, when it is current Conservative ministers who have paved the way for this scandal. Mr. Speaker, when it comes to lobbying, it takes two to tango. For every former minister lobbying, there is someone in power being lobbied. And this is why this scandal isn't just about the conduct of David Cameron during his time as Prime Minister and in the years afterwards. This is about who he lobbied in the current government and how they responded. Lex Greensill was awarded a CBE and made a Crown representative by a Conservative government. Yet his company's spectacular collapse now means over 50,000 jobs are at risk around the world, including thousands in UK's steel communities. From Hartlepool to Stocksbridge, from Rotherham to Scunthorpe and to Newport, the steel industry is crucial, and the government must make clear that our steel industry will not pay the price for the failures at Greensill and beyond. This government have set up an inquiry, but just about supply chain finance and Greensill. Such a review is wholly inadequate, and deliberately so. They don't want to explore what needs to change in lobbying, or who currently gets access to power, or the wider issue of how to lift the lid, lift standards which have fallen so far in the 10 years of Conservative governments. Mr. Speaker, they don't want public hearings. They don't want the disinfectant of sunlight, as David Cameron once urged. They just want this to go away, which is why they have chosen Nigel Boardman to chair the inquiry. It is a fact that Nigel Boardman is a good friend, a very good friend of the Conservative government. Now, some may suspect that the son of a former Conservative cabinet minister might be unlikely to make waves. But let's look at his own record. Mr. Boardman has been paid over £20,000 per year as a non-executive director at the Department of Business, Energy and Industrial Strategy, a department with a real interest in the British Business Bank, which lent to Greensill, and the British steel industry, where so many jobs are now at risk. Mr. Boardman has already whitewashed the government's handling of public procurement during the pandemic, and I fear that he will do the same again with this inquiry. Mr. Speaker, you will remember that I jointly chaired the inquiry into the collapse of Carillion. The fact that Mr. Boardman's law firm made £8 million advising Carillion, including £1 million on the day before the outsourcer's collapse, it leaves a terrible taste in my mouth, and it should do in the mouths of members opposite. And to cap it all off, Mr. Boardman was appointed to a prestigious role at the British Museum by David Cameron. What is being proposed by the government is not remotely fit for purpose. It's not an inquiry, it's not independent, it's an insult to us all. Mr. Speaker, the scope of this inquiry has got to be bigger than supply chain financing. It's got to be about lobbying too, and bigger than what rules were broken. If the existing lobbying rules were not breached, then that is a big part of the problem, surely. Had the Conservatives backed Labour's amendments to the lobbying bill back in 2014, then there would have been much more transparency. But they didn't. David Cameron and his government voted them down. And boy, are they exploiting them now. We need public service in the national interest, not viewing the state like some get-rich-quick scheme with taxpayers treated as collateral damage. Now, we learn that the Conservatives are joined by the SNP in all of this, whose Rural Economy Secretary in the Scottish Government dined with Lex Greensill in one of Glasgow's finest restaurants with no officials, no notes, no emails, no texts, no phone records about the meeting. And here in Westminster, we have witnessed the degrading of the ministerial code. I'll happily take a point.
As the Minister, and at the moment we have absolutely no quibble with what the Shadow Minister has been saying, but is she trying to draw an equivalence between what David Cameron did and what Fergus Ewing did in a meeting which was recorded and is publicly available and has been for a long, long time on the Scottish Government's own website? there was nothing untoward with what Fergus Ewing did. And to try and to conflate both, I think the lady does a great disservice to herself and her argument.
Well, the Scottish people can be the judge of that. And if you think that a Scottish minister dining with Lex Greensill is okay, then put that on your leaflets in the elections in May. Sir Alex Allen, you'll remember, Mr. Speaker, he resigned as an independent advisor on ministerial interests following the Prime Minister's failure to take action on the Home Secretary's bullying behaviour. Mr. Speaker, that was 5 months ago now. This government haven't replaced him. They haven't even advertised the job. What does that say about how seriously this government takes standards? I'll very happily give way to the right honourable gentleman.
I just point out that when Gordon Brown appointed his Prime Minister's advisor on ministerial interests, that job wasn't advertised either, because it isn't advertised. It's a Prime Ministerial appointment. But can I just ask, her motion is proposing to set up a new select committee when there are many existing select committees, and I am chairman of the liaison committee. Why hasn't she consulted any of us about this manoeuvre? I appreciate what oppositions do, which is to try and embarrass the government, but she's right that there are much wider issues to address, and shouldn't we try and address these issues in a bipartisan manner?
Thank you to the honourable gentleman for the intervention. On the point of Sir Alex Allen, the point is that we're 5 months later and nobody has been appointed to this role. Whether we advertise the role or not, the point is it's been vacant for 5 months. The honourable gentleman says from a sedentary position, I think, that it will happen shortly. Well, 5 months is an awful long time. I'm going to come on to the issue of the composition of the Select Committee. But like the right honourable gentleman, I had the privilege of chairing a Select Committee. And when scandals happen, we looked into them, as we did with the collapse of Carillion. I know the right honourable gentleman did so himself. But the problem is there is no overarching inquiry planned into what happened, not just with Greensill, but more widely around lobbying and cronyism and sleaze. And I'm very happy to work on a cross-party basis to take this forward, and I welcome the comments from the right honourable gentleman himself over the last couple of days. As well as the lack of an advisor on ministerial interests, there has been an absence of ministerial interests being published. They were supposed to be published twice a year, but they were published only once last year in July, and not at all since then. Now, Mr. Speaker, these things matter. They are about the foundations on which the standards of government rest. And under this government, those foundations are being consciously removed. And that is why this motion today does what the government should have done, but chose not to. It gives the power to this House, not the government, with a 16-strong select committee with clout to investigate this whole sorry scandal. It would have powers to call witnesses and examine them in public, like an effective select committee would. The scope of the investigation that we propose would look at inappropriate lobbying of government and what needs to be done to change and prevent it. It would have the powers needed to demand witnesses and communications. It would examine the advisory committee on business appointments and whether they have the sufficient powers, resources and the right remit. Put simply, this special new select committee would aim to tackle the problem staring us in the face, not to cover it up. I'll give way to the honourable gentleman.
I note and thank her for her motion. I just wondered why she thought it was appropriate that the membership of that committee be nominated by the Committee of Selection. Why should it be filled with a load of whip stooges?
Richard Rees.
I won't comment on how select committee chairs sometimes elected in this place. But look, as a former select committee chair, I know how seriously colleagues around the House would take this responsibility, as the honourable gentleman does. We are prepared to make a concession to honourable members opposite. We will accept that this committee can be chaired by a backbencher from the governing party, as long as there is cross-party representation on the committee, as with other select committees. Now, the Conservative Party, party opposite, are at a fork in the road. If MPs vote for this motion, then a proper investigation can take place, led by a team with the confidence of this House, not someone handpicked from the board of one of the government departments embroiled in this scandal, but if they vote against it, as the Prime Minister has told you all to do, then I am sorry to say that they too will be part of the government's attempt to cover up Tory sleaze. All members here today should reflect on who they are here to serve, their constituents and their country, or narrow party political interests. And the stakes are high for our democracy and our public life. It was a past Conservative government embroiled in sleaze in the 1990s, which eventually recognised the need for standards to rise and to create the Nolan Principles. The Nolan Principles of public life have to live and breathe through all those in public office, serving our great country. Yesterday we learned that the government's former head of procurement was an advisor to Greensill while still a civil servant. And incredibly, that was approved. And the defence is that it was not uncommon. I mean, what on earth was happening at the Cabinet Office and at the heart of government to allow these conflicts of interests to fester? Sir John Major, who witnessed the Cash for Questions scandal and other Tory sleaze in the 90s when he was Prime Minister, also believes that the rules need to be changed again. Now, one of the Nolan Principles, Mr. Speaker, as you well know, is leadership. So with that in mind, where is the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster today? And where was the Chancellor of the Exchequer yesterday? What have they got to hide, Mr. Speaker? There is a wider pattern of behaviour with the Conservatives here, in the present as well as in the recent past. A Conservative government which is more interested in private drinks with the owners of private jets than they are with meeting the families of those bereaved by COVID. A government which gave a 40% pay rise to Dominic Cummings, but a pay cut to nurses. Tory politicians thinking that it's one rule for them and another rule for everybody else. Personal attention lavished on friends of Cameron, while 3 million people are excluded from government financial support and they can't even get a meeting with the Treasury. If the honourable member wants to defend all that, be my guest.
Right Honourable Lady, on the subject of leadership, of course, she's touched on the Scottish government. But the Welsh government, of course, has been in place for 22 years, still has no lobbying register, and recently ACOBA, of course, have taken the former First Minister, the former Labour First Minister, to task over an appointment to GLG. So on leadership, can I outdraw her on those points?
Well, as far as I'm aware, the First Minister of Wales does not appointed a financier to be his advisor. He hasn't got £30 million worth of share options that he fancies exercising. And the honourable gentleman has abstained in a vote today to give a pay rise to nurses. Well, you know, I'd say put that on your election leaflet at the next general election. Now, £2 billion of public contracts in the last year have gone to friends and donors of the Conservative Party, rolling out the red carpet with a VIP fast lane for contracts. Supposedly independent reports rewritten by Downing Street, undeclared details on who has paid what for a luxury refurbishment of the number 10 Downing Street flat. Relationships undisclosed, increasingly frequent breaches and casual disregard for the ministerial code. Some have asked this week, quite powerfully, when did we stop caring about honesty and integrity? That is what this motion is about. What happens in the vote will say so much about our great country, but also about our current government. That is why I urge all honourable and right honourable members to do the right thing and back this motion today. Vote for a proper investigation, to close the loopholes, to rein in the lobbyists and to lift standards in this great democracy in which we all have the privilege to serve.
The question is, as on the order paper, I am now going to go over to Chloe Smith.
Thank you very much indeed, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, I welcome the chance to contribute today to this Opposition Day debate, and I am sure you will appreciate that it is appropriate and possible to do so virtually. Can I first of all add my own tribute to those made earlier this week to His Royal Highness the Duke of Edinburgh, whose commitment to the service of this country and to the highest possible standards of conduct was exemplary. Mr. Speaker, during the extraordinary challenge of COVID-19, the government has worked with people and businesses of all sorts, from private citizens to key workers, from our brilliant SMEs to multinationals. And in that monumental effort to protect the public and save lives across the country, civil servants across government, working under incredible pressure, have achieved extraordinary things. And even away from times of crisis, this country can be proud of the standards that we do uphold. In Transparency International's 2020 index, which ranks countries, the United Kingdom was ranked above close European neighbours such as France and Ireland in 11th place. We are the first G20 country to establish a public register of domestic company beneficial ownership and the first G7 country to undergo an IMF fiscal transparency evaluation. Mr. Speaker, this government values such reputation and will always uphold it. And as honourable members heard my right honourable friend, the Prime Minister, say just now, we are concerned at some of what has emerged in recent weeks. Most of what this complex motion proposes is already being done. And indeed, Mr. Speaker, as the Policy Minister responsible, it is perfectly sensible for me to respond today on behalf of my department. The Honourable Lady for the Opposition has shadowed me before 10 years ago, and it is good to see her again today in her place. Mr. Speaker, the motion seeks to establish in standing orders a select committee with a remit so wide-ranging as to cut across Parliament's existing committees and independent bodies that have responsibilities in this area. Let's take the elements part by part. Looking at the effectiveness of existing legislation on lobbying, the government is already doing this, and I should explain more in a second. The Greensill affair, an independent review, was announced this week before this motion was laid and will be effective. Transparency measures, the ACOBAR framework, the Cabinet Office is already working to strengthen the former and supporting my noble friend Lord Pickles' reforms to bolster the latter. We are opposing the motion today because it seeks to duplicate the work that is already in the gift of Parliament and its committees, and, as I will set out now, work that is already being undertaken by the government. Starting with the effectiveness of existing lobbying legislation, we are currently conducting post-legislative scrutiny of Part 1 of the Transparency of Lobbying, Non-Party Campaigning and Trade Union Administration Act 2014, which for short we all know as the Lobbying Act. It is looking precisely at the scope and effectiveness of that legislation. The Honourable Lady did not mention this one whit. That legislation introduced a new statutory register of consultant lobbyists and a requirement that those undertaking paid lobbying on behalf of any third party must register and make clear who they are representing to ministers and permanent secretaries. The requirement for consultant lobbyists to declare that work complements the system of self-regulation that lobbyists also adhere to through professional codes of conduct, and it makes transparent, otherwise hidden lobbying. It remains an important part of the framework, filling an accountability and transparency gap that existed prior to that point. We think it operates effectively, but as I have said, we are looking at whether there are further improvements that can be made, as is best practice through post-legislative scrutiny. And once that work is complete, we intend to deliver a memorandum to the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, PACAC, for further scrutiny. Would it really be constructive for these work streams to be undertaken in parallel by separate committees, potentially cutting across one another, sowing confusion? We think it would not. Whilst the creation of select committees is, of course, a matter for the House, Mr. Speaker, there are already relevant committees in Parliament with the powers and capacity to do such work as is proposed. PACAC, and I note that the Honourable Gentleman who is the chair of that committee has already spoken, and indeed the prior chair of that committee has already spoken today. That committee is responsible for the examination of the quality and standards of administration across the government. In this Parliament, it has already undertaken relevant inquiries. Indeed, it's also called the chair of the Committee on the Standards in Public Life to give evidence. With powers provided in its standing orders to send for, with powers as proposed for the new proposed committee to send for persons, papers and records and to report to the House, I question the necessity of an additional committee. Indeed, the additional committee proposed would also cost £250,000. Mr. Speaker, Her Majesty's government has a full framework in place to ensure that public money is spent efficiently and that those who serve as stewards of these public resources act in accordance with the highest standards and in the public interest. The use of public money is overseen by the Treasury and, of course, Parliament. and the use of public position and information is overseen by the Cabinet Office and rightly held to account by Parliament and the public. Furthermore, all those who work across the public sector are expected to maintain the ethical standards embodied in the 7 principles of public life, which underpin the respective codes for ministers, the civil service and special advisors, as well as the code of conduct for board members of public bodies. Now, that requirement to act with integrity means that public office holders must avoid placing themselves under any obligation to people or organisations that might try to inappropriately influence them in their work. And all holders of public office must declare and resolve any interests. We are not complacent, Mr. Speaker, neither about the scale of this challenge nor about taking action where necessary to uphold the public's faith in what we should all stand for. Since 2010, under the coalition and then under Conservative governments, we have significantly increased the transparency on the workings of government, which the public should rightly be able to expect, from publishing contracts and detail of spending, salaries, tenders and meetings, to launching that statutory register of consultant lobbyists. And this is far more than ever published under the last Labour government. This government has banned the once endemic practice of government quangos hiring lobbyists to lobby the government. It has ensured that taxpayer-funded government grants are not then used to lobby the government itself. It has introduced greater transparency of trade unions and campaign finance controls on third parties seeking to lobby in our elections. So when the government is being held up to account, as is right, it is because a tougher regime of transparency has been in place for over a decade and is now the norm. We are going further still to uphold the covenant of trust with the public. I've already touched on the government's review of lobbying legislation. In addition, we are reviewing and improving business appointment rules, and Mr. Speaker, I will return to that in a moment or two. But as the Honourable Lady dwelt upon at some length, the Cabinet Office this week has announced a review on behalf of the Prime Minister into the role in government of Greensill Capital, the finance company that went into administration last month. The review will look at the development and use of supply chain finance associated activities in government, and specifically the role of Greensill, including how contracts were secured and business representatives engaged with government. The review will be wide-ranging and will also consider the issues raised by my noble friend Lord Pickles regarding Mr. Bill Crothers' role at Greensill Capital. And the public can be assured that Mr. Nigel Boardman, the senior lawyer leading the review, who will pause his activities as a non-executive director at the Department for Business for the duration, will have full access to the people who were in government at the relevant time who made the relevant decisions. And already, I would add that the information that has emerged in recent weeks about Greensill Capital has done so in some part because the system in place is doing its job and ensuring the support of transparency and accountability. Mr. Speaker, I won't go into great detail further about recent events because that inquiry will do so. But I think two further things can be said now about lobbying policy. Firstly, the Registrar of Consultant Lobbyists conducted an investigation into Mr. David Cameron's activities and has confirmed that those did not require registration under the current legislative framework. These rules apply to consultant lobbyists for good reason, who may seek to influence policymaking on behalf of a third party who would otherwise be hidden. Mr. Cameron was working openly in-house as an employee. Now, to complement this law, the meetings of ministers and permanent secretaries with external organisations are published on a quarterly basis and are made available on gov.uk. This data describes both the purpose of a meeting and the names of the organisations or individuals who are met with. This is very important. Regulation, of course, must balance the need for transparency by lobbyists while not preventing engagement by the voluntary and private sector. The second thing to say here, Mr. Speaker, is to engage in the politics of today's opposition day, although it is a great shame to do so in a period of national mourning. The Honourable Lady for the Opposition failed to add that Labour now want to repeal the 2014 Lobbying Act. This was in their manifesto, alongside repealing the Trade Union Act 2016. Who is not to say that the Labour Party would simply give favours to the union barons who bankroll them? And after the EU referendum, Labour MPs have called for tighter controls on third-party campaigning. But their official policy is to rip up these lobbying laws. Indeed, in 2014, at the time of making the law, the Labour Party supported amendments that would have placed significant barriers on engagement and required thousands of businesses, charities, NGOs and trade bodies to pay a registration fee of £1,000 a year to write or speak to ministers. This could have been detrimental to the public interest during the COVID pandemic, when groups across civil society rightly wanted to put their case to government. But today, Mr. Speaker, I will agree with the Honourable Lady that transparency and probity are fundamental. I would like to cover one more area about business appointment rules. As I've mentioned, the Cabinet Office is working with Lord Pickles, who is the chair of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments, ACOBA for short, to improve and extend the business appointments regime. That applies lobbying bans to former ministers and civil servants, including special advisors. These rules, the business appointment rules, seek to protect the integrity of the government whilst allowing for people to move on to roles outside government. Whilst affording ACOBA statutory powers to enforce these rules, I think would be out of line with the general principle of UK law that ministers and officials are subject to the same legal system and statutory framework as everybody else, ACOBA is able to enforce a range of sanctions for non-compliance, and this is very important. The government supports changes being introduced by ACOBA to improve the business appointment process. A framework for the risk-based consideration of cases aims to bring greater transparency and improve the reporting of any breach of the rules, increasing the moral and reputational pressure on those leaving public office. The Cabinet Office, in addition, is leading work to improve the scope and clarity and enforcement of the rules and how consistently and proportionately they are implemented across government. In short, Mr. Speaker, we are taking action on a range of fronts to ensure that we maintain the highest standards in our politics and public life. Mr. Speaker, we should all condemn the kind of lobbying that gives politics and politicians a bad name on all sides of the House. But this motion does not achieve that. Instead, it sidetracks, proliferates, and duplicates. In conclusion, I invite Labour to settle its own view, find its own position, and agree with us that transparency and probity are vitally important. I urge all honourable members and right honourable members to join us in this work to continue to scrutinise these critically important matters through the work of existing select committees, through the Committee on Standards in Public Life, through the inquiry we have now set up, and our other ongoing unstinting efforts, which of course are accountable to this House, and to vote against this unnecessary and unconstructive motion that achieves so little extra. It is incumbent, Mr. Speaker, on all politicians to act with integrity as elected members, as ministers where we are, and in accordance with the principles of public life. It is incumbent on all of us in this House to ensure that important issues are carefully and effectively scrutinised. I have explained today how the government is playing its part in this, and I urge all honourable members to vote against this motion today.
We now come to SNP spokesperson Brendan O'Hara.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I believe that secret corporate lobbying goes to the heart of why people are so fed up with politics. It arouses people's worst fears and suspicions about how our political system works, with money buying power, power fishing for money, and a cosy club at the top of decision-making in their own interests. It's an issue that has tainted our politics for too long, an issue that exposes the far too cosy relationship between politics, government, business and money. Wise words indeed, and I wish they were mine. They're not. They were said by David Cameron in February 2010, just a few short months before he became Prime Minister. Became Prime Minister with the promise that if we win the election, we will take a lead on this issue by making sure that ex-ministers are not allowed to use their contacts and their knowledge gained while being paid by the public service to further their own private gain. And today, David Cameron, that self-styled great reformer, is up to his neck in the same cronyism, corruption and sleaze that he promised to call out, expose and eradicate while in opposition. The hypocrisy is breathtaking, not simply because nothing has changed, because we now know that far from taking on the corrosive culture of the nod and a wink of the old boys club favouritism, he actually took it into government. We now know that while David Cameron was Prime Minister, Lex Greensill himself became so embedded in Downing Street that by 2012 he even had an official number 10 business card describing himself as a senior advisor. Almost 10 years to the day after delivering those stirring words and those great promises, we discover that David Cameron had directly lobbied the Chancellor of the Exchequer, the Secretary of State for Health and senior government officials, thereby securing 10 meetings in 3 months in an attempt to influence the UK government's COVID corporate financing facility. And he did it to benefit Greensill Capital, where he was then working as an advisor and lobbyist for the same Lex Greensill, and where he reportedly held share options worth millions of pounds. And I invite members to compare and contrast that level of access to the Chancellor and the powers that be at the centre of government to that given to the millions of people and the businesses who were left without any UK government support during the pandemic, particularly the group of the excluded, those 3 million self-employed people who have been left without a penny of government support. What chance, or what would they have given for just one opportunity that was afforded Mr Cameron, let alone the 10 that he got? And I wonder if at any point while brokering those meetings, did Mr Cameron recall his own hollow words of February 2010 when he said, "We all know how it works. The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-minister and the ex-advisor for hire, helping big business find the right way to get its way." Of course, now it transpires that the Greensill influence in Downing Street during the Cameron years went even further and deeper than we could ever have imagined, with the revelation, the quite astonishing revelation, that in 2015, one of Britain's most senior civil servants was given permission to work part-time as an advisor to the board of Greensill while still serving as the UK government's head of procurement. How is it possible that the Cabinet Office gave the green light for the former government chief commercial officer at the Cabinet Office to become part of Greensill Capital in September 2015, while still working as a supposedly impartial civil servant? Who authorised such a move? Who approved this appointment? Who thought that that was okay? And I wonder, what questions did the people at the Cabinet Office internal conflict of interest policy actually ask in order to reach the conclusion that it was perfectly all right for one of the UK's most senior civil servants to twin-track and to work for a private finance company whose owner at that point was swanning about Downing Street, dishing out business cards, describing himself as a special advisor to the Prime Minister? It beggars belief. This is crony capitalism at its worst. It stinks. And the closer you get to it, the more it reeks. And that's why we'll be supporting a full, independent and transparent investigation, and we will be supporting this motion when the House divides this evening. Mr Speaker, on its own, the Greensill scandal would be bad enough. Unfortunately, it's far from being an isolated event. And it's just the most recent example of the rampant cronyism that's at heart at the very centre of this government, who seems to be stumbling from one scandal to another as this details emerge of a network of those who have become fabulously wealthy during this pandemic, not because of their skill or their business acumen, but because of their political connections. In November last year, the National Audit Office revealed that companies with political connections who wanted to supply the UK with PPE were directed to a high-priority channel, where their bids were 10 times more likely to be successful than those bids from companies who did not have links to politicians and senior government officials. In and of itself, the existence of this high-priority channel is quite remarkable, but I believe it becomes far more sinister when one considers that the National Audit Office also reported that there were no written rules as to how this high-priority channel should operate, meaning that the companies gaining political support had access to hundreds of millions of pounds of public funds and were not subject to the usual procurement rules and could bypass the essential paperwork that in normal times would be a prerequisite to safeguarding against misuse of public funds. No matter what way one looks at it, it's not a good look. And I absolutely agree with Professor Liz David Barrett of the University of Sussex when she said, "It's not clear to me why MPs or peers should have any special expertise on whether a company is qualified to provide PPE or not." And she's absolutely right. And she went on to make the entirely reasonable point that normally those of us who could be described as being politically exposed persons are usually treated at being higher risk and therefore deserving of more scrutiny rather than less. Yes, I'll give way.
Well, gentlemen, for giving way, I intervened purely to ask because I asked a parliamentary question about the standards being applied to companies on this supposed fast-track list versus others, to check that the same due diligence standards were being applied to both sides and there was a level playing field. The answer I got back was that they were, and that in this respect the playing field was level. So would he care to just reconsider his point that the same processes weren't applied?
I thank the honourable gentleman's intervention. What I would love to happen is for the committee, when it meets, to examine that in detail to find out if that exactly is true. What is inescapable is that if you are 10 times more likely to receive a government contract from a political contact than not, then I think that's something that deserves careful scrutiny and indeed has to be smoked out to the nth degree. I will.
Madam Deputy Speaker, I thank the honourable gentleman for giving way. However we collectively as the body politic got into this situation, could I suggest that it is destroying or damaging the public trust in elected representatives? And the one good thing about this committee would to be seen to be put in place was it might restore some of that trust and repair some of the damage to democracy in the UK.
I thank the honourable gentleman, and he is right when he says that. I think we will all know from our post bag that regardless of which side of the House one is on in this debate, we are all tainted by it. And anything that could shine a light, admittedly where some might not want a light to be shone, would be a very, very good thing, and I wholeheartedly support it. Madam Deputy Speaker.
I'm very grateful, but isn't there a different point here, which is about whatever inquiry needs to be done needs to have proper powers. It needs to be able to guarantee that anybody who's going to give evidence, for instance, is able to do so without fear of prosecution, so that if there is a whistle that needs to be blown, it can be blown. And it needs to have subpoena powers so that people who don't necessarily really want to give evidence are forced to do so. And that, so far as I can see, is only really provided by either by a judge-led inquiry, maybe we should go down that route, but I think that's unnecessary, or by a parliamentary inquiry.
The short answer is yes, absolutely, and it's something I will come on to in a moment. That's why it's so important that that is the case. Madam Deputy Speaker, it's not just members of this House who are questioning the corrosive culture of cronyism at the heart of this government. It's been attracting some fairly high-profile international attention too. At the end of last year, the New York Times decided to investigate how the UK government managed what it described as the greatest spending spree in the post-war era. And they concluded that of the 1,200 central government contracts worth nearly £22 billion, that $11 billion went to companies either run by friends and associates of politicians in the Conservative Party or with no prior experience or with a history of controversy. It's an incredible amount of money, and any hint that it has been spent at the behest of someone with close ties to Downing Street or for the benefit of companies who have political allies within government is deeply worrying, and it has to be examined, and examined fully, robustly and independently. And while people might understand and accept that things had to happen quickly in these circumstances, and that perhaps normal procurement rules were not sufficiently speedy, they will not accept that a government has any right to rip up every rule, every standard, every safeguard and start throwing about public money like a scramble at a wedding, particularly when it's their mates who are there waiting to pick up the money. Madam Deputy Speaker, I will.
Thank them for giving way. Do you agree with me that perhaps the committee should look at other activities this government gets up to? See when it's things like the Brexit contracts. If you recall, they gave a contract to a ferry company that had no ferries. We've got all the appointments to external bodies and regulators, which again is full examples of cronyism, and so we need to look at this in the bigger mix as well.
I absolutely agree with my honourable friend, and I'm sure it won't have escaped the Treasury bench. Madam Deputy Speaker, setting up the government's inquiry led by Nigel Boardman simply won't work. It cannot be seen to be independent, as we've heard, because of the baggage and the backstory that he has. Mr Boardman may have carte blanche to ask whatever question to whomever he likes, but they will have carte blanche not to answer those questions. And if that's the case, what's the point? I've no doubt that this scandal will rumble on, and when it does, we have to have a mechanism that is robust enough to see it. Back in 2010, in his now risible speech, Mr Cameron said, we can't go on like this. It's time we shone a light into the lobbying in our country, and we forced politics to come clean about who's buying power and influence. I wish he'd meant it back in 2010. We've got to mean it now, and that's why we will be supporting this motion.
Thank you. We have many speakers to get in what is a fairly short debate, so I will impose a 4-minute time limit to start with. That will be on the clock here and also on the screens for those participating virtually, but it will probably fairly quickly have to go down to 3 minutes. I call the Chair of the Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, William Ragg.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And can I thank the opposition for putting forward a motion to establish a committee, but gently point out to them that one already exists, namely the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, which this House has given me the honour of chairing. So I trust that the motion before us is not a vote of no confidence in either me or indeed the very independent-minded membership of that committee. Now, I can forgive that oversight, indeed momentarily forgetting the existence of that committee, because in a week of national mourning, and even on the day of tributes to his late Royal Highness, I did not think it seemly to be prattling about television studios, and nor for that matter did I think it was at all seemly for Mr Cameron's statement to be released at that time as well. But rest assured, the committee is and will be giving these matters proper consideration. And perhaps to labour the point made by the Leader of the Opposition, Prime Minister's questions, and no doubt it will fall similarly flat when I say it too, but I'm more than happy to take up as the AC12 of Whitehall. But further motion proposed this afternoon could be taken from the script of Sunday night's episode. And for the benefit of the tape, Madam Deputy Speaker, I have full confidence in the members of the committee to discharge their duties and do not require a reorganisation. The House will note that the committee's public session with Lord Pickles tomorrow morning, who as chair of the Advisory Committee on Business Appointments will doubtless have a vital contribution to make in illuminating matters. We also intend to have the Cabinet Secretary before the committee within the next fortnight. I would ask the House to be assured that we will pursue every possible line of inquiry with our witnesses and shall conduct ourselves without fear or favour. Without prejudicing these inquiries, I will offer a reflection on the crux of the issue. And I wonder if the attention given to the former Prime Minister, Mr Cameron, is somewhat of a red herring. It is no doubt a tasteless, slapdash and unbecoming episode for any former Prime Minister. But is it the central issue? After all, what is the key attribute of a former minister or senior official? Surely we are all institutionalised and de-skilled by public life. What possibly qualifies a former minister or senior official? Food for thought. There are, I think, 4 key areas of questioning ahead. Firstly, the collapse of Greensill Capital has highlighted the shortcomings of APPROX rules and their application. Secondly, does APPROX's oversight end completely 2 years after a former minister or official has left their post? Thirdly, a senior official appears to have moved from the civil service position to join Greensill without application to APPROX. Is a secondment a technicality, or at least a breach, or indeed actual breach of the rules, a spirit or actual breach. Fourthly, Mr Greensill appears to have been a special advisor at 10 Downing Street. As a SPAD, he would have fallen within APPROX's remit, and if so, did he comply with the business appointment rules? Happily do so.
I thank my honourable friend, and I think the questions he's posing actually are accommodated within the rules, but what we're really talking about is behaviour. And would he not agree with me that it's actually about the principles, the very Nolan principles, which if everybody was involved in public service viewed them as a code of practice for life, we could avoid a lot of this.
I think it's often the case that if an individual's attitude and if their sense of public probity was such, there would be no need for rules, but I fear that we are at risk quite often in falling short, and I can see the chair of the liaison committee indicating he wishes to intervene.
Brief, Madam Deputy Speaker, which is just to make the point that the 2017 PACAC report into the APPROX rules actually recommended changes to the Ministerial Code and the Civil Service Code, so there would be proper conversations about these conflicts of interest as they arise, which do not take place in the current atmosphere.
My honourable friend is entirely correct, and that 2017 report as a legacy report of the previous committee is something which I believe the whole of the new committee entirely endorse as well. We would wish to see those recommendations taken forward. I am at risk of indulging the honourable gentleman too much, but yes.
It's just to say that, of course, the Nolan principles are embodied in the code of conduct that affects all MPs, and all of this is in danger of bringing the whole of the House into disrepute. So I very much hope that his committee will work with my committee, the Committee on Standards, as we are reviewing the code of conduct to make sure that it really does work for the modern era.
Thank you for his intervention. And Madam Deputy Speaker, honourable and right honourable members should always be careful in using the privilege afforded to us in speaking in this House. But I find it odd that the leaked emails should be from the late Cabinet Secretary, which cannot be contextualised or challenged by a man who is dead. We must be mindful of scapegoating, especially when it appears too neat. But neither should we allow conspiracy theories to abound without challenge. In the debate that follows, difficult as it may be, I would ask my honourable and right honourable friends not to unquestioningly defend the integrity of others if they have doubts or have been asked to do so. Whatever little or imperfect integrity we have ourselves, for we are all fallible, it is the only integrity we can seek to protect.
We now go to Carl Turner.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I don't intend to detain the House for very long, as I know many of my colleagues are wanting to speak in this very important debate, and I think for very good reason. Madam Deputy Speaker, the revelations reported in the press these past weeks of private messages between the Chancellor and the former Prime Minister David Cameron, private drinks between Mr Greensill and the Health Secretary, and a private network of connections between favoured businesses and government ministers are an absolute disgrace and a scandal. Sadly, they are just the tip of the iceberg of Crowleyism and sleaze rife in the Conservative Party, which they have now allowed into the heart of our government. When many small businesses in Hull have had to fight tooth and nail to access financial support during this pandemic, it is insulting that corporations who could afford to have a former Prime Minister on the payroll can have cosy fireside chats with those at the very top of government. My constituents, Madam Deputy Speaker, in East Hull expect better than this. They expect, whatever the party in power, government should be run on the principles of honesty, decency, and commitment to public service. Not government by WhatsApp and billions of pounds of public money dished out to friends and donors of the Tory party. That's why, Madam Deputy Speaker, we cannot allow the government to mark their own homework with a whitewash review. A review that we know what the findings will be before it's even begun. We need a full parliamentary inquiry to get to the bottom of this scandal. An inquiry with power, with teeth, one that will give taxpayers and the many thousands of people whose livelihoods are now at risk due to Greensill's collapse the explanations and justice they fully deserve. Those who have nothing to hide would have nothing to fear. Members on the opposite benches need to think long and hard about which way they'll vote today. Will they vote to sweep this all under the carpet and in the hope that it'll just move on? Or will they do the decent thing? Put standards in public life in this country before their party's interest and vote for transparency and fairness. I'm sincerely hoping that we'll see some backbone from MPs on the opposite benches when the division bell rings later today. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
John Penrose.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And I think there's a widespread consensus across the House that this is a very difficult moment and one which is causing great concern. But there is a widespread disagreement about how to take it forward. And I was been much struck by my honourable friend, the Select Committee Chair's point that actually what's being proposed is something which his committee already has the powers to do and that he's standing ready to fill in any gaps that he feels may be left, or his committee feels may be left as a result of the inquiry which has just been announced. So between those two things, I can see no reason to support the motion today. However, because there is such an important underlying issue here, because there are such important and central questions about the future of our democracy and the probity, the legitimacy of our system, there are some important points which do need to be made and which I hope that the Minister will be able to address when she gets to her feet at the end of this. Madam Deputy Speaker, I have put up on my website today a submission I made to the Committee on Standards in Public Life's current inquiry. It will be made public in due course by them in any case, so I'm not preempting anything here, which has a series of proposals about how we should improve things going forward around lobbying and much else. And in fact, the Minister for the Constitution, in her earlier remarks, said that there are already some post-legislative scrutiny work going on around the Lobbying Act, which I've contributed to. I just wanted to share with everybody here, in the brief time I have, some of the things which I believe could usefully be done to improve the Lobbying Act. The Lobbying Act has many strengths. It does an enormous amount of things tremendously importantly well, but it is now 7 years old. It is time to review it. It is time to move it on. And there are 3 or 4 things which I think we could usefully do, quite apart from the current concerns over Greensill, and which we should do in any case. What are they? Well, to start with, Madam Deputy Speaker, the current disclosures of who ministers meet and when, which we've already heard from various people, are tremendously important as the foundation stone for transparency and disclosure. Those disclosures don't happen fast enough. They aren't complete enough, they aren't mutually comprehensible and machine readable and searchable enough, and as a result it is much, much too difficult at the moment to link up who ministers have met with who the lobbyists are working for, with who is donating money to which political party. All those 3 things should be immediately understandable, immediately searchable, and immediately identifiable in order for the system to work well. They don't at the moment. It's a sensible change and one which we should introduce immediately. The second thing which we should also do is to capture more people in those disclosures. At the moment they apply to ministers, rightly, and to senior civil servants, permanent secretaries and the like. But there are other people whose opinions matter and who will seek to be being influenced by lobbyists, no matter who is doing the lobbying. Those are political advisors, SPADs, but also a whole slew of other civil servants below the rank of permanent secretaries, and their meetings all should be disclosed and the topics disclosed in the same way. Equally, when it comes to the register for consultant lobbyists, people will have seen that it's proposed that everybody who is doing lobbying should be included on that register. That seems to me, Madam Deputy Speaker, to be overkill. Because if somebody comes from Rolls-Royce to speak to a minister, we all know on whose behalf they are lobbying. They're lobbying on behalf of Rolls-Royce. Simply putting them into the register for consultant lobbyists won't improve things. Whereas disclosing what they talked about, why they talked about it, and what any conclusions that were reached would make a huge difference. Equally, foreign agents, people who are working on behalf of foreign powers who are not part of the diplomatic corps of that country should also be disclosed as well. And finally, Madam Deputy Speaker, the about to be reappointed Prime Ministerial Advisor on Special Interests, if they had the power to launch independent investigations as well, we wouldn't need this debate today at all, because they would have opined already.
We now go to Ian Lavery.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. You know, when David Cameron in 2010 claimed cronyism was the next big scandal waiting to happen, I'm not sure if any of us thought that he was quite so committed to making sure that his predictions would come so true. And yet the Greensill scandal emits a horrid stench, and Mr. Cameron and all others involved must be held accountable. But you know, it's only a drop in the ocean in what is a tidal wave of cronyism and corruption at the upper echelons of this Conservative government. This isn't just about, as the former member of Bolsover rightly dubbed him, Dodgy Dave, but it's about the cancer of cronyism that spread through the whole top level of the Conservative government, from the Curie affair to the COVID-19 contracts, and now the parasitic lobbying that includes the former Tory Prime Minister. I must say it's hardly a red herring indeed. Over the course of the past year, there's been a tale of two pandemics in this country. One for the elites who have siphoned off billions of hard-earned taxpayers' money, and one for the millions of the others who have been shielded, working as key workers on the front line of the pandemic, or they've lost their jobs, all to protect the health of this country. But how did these elites get such a cosy seat at the table? It certainly wasn't as a result of hard work and sacrifice like we see from those key workers. Their destiny was written as they walked the halls of the public schools and elite social clubs, making murky connections that propel them into snug lobbying jobs or even safe Tory seats. Contrast this, Madam Deputy Speaker, with a constituent of mine attending an underfunded local school with huge class sizes, who then becomes a key worker, toiling each day to keep the country on their feet for an honest wage. Just to see their taxes being spent on contracts given to dodgy companies with no competitive tendering. You know, the very people who have been hit hardest by the pandemic, those who have been put on furlough, are expected to work twice as hard, while the public school clique see the opportunity to multiply their already avaricious wealth even further. There's hundreds of British gas workers today will be losing their jobs for standing up to a cruel fire and rehire scheme by their employers, seeking to lower their wages in worse terms and conditions in the midst of a global crisis. Whilst at the same time, those with close ties to senior members of the Conservative government can simply pick up the phone and call a Jobs for the Boys hotline and bag a £1 million contract, despite having no qualifications to do so. Quite simply, two realities being played out, Madam Deputy Speaker, here in modern Britain. One for the elite and one for the rest of us. To get through this pandemic, the people of the country have pulled together, made huge sacrifices to see each other through. Yet this government is not in it together with our constituents. They're the more concerned with protecting their lobbying clients' financial interests than they are the public health of this country. And as a result, they, to put it bluntly, have a lot to answer for. I'm supporting this motion today because it's all about transparency. It's about probity, accountability, clarity, honesty, decency, integrity, fairness, and equality. Madam Deputy Speaker, there's two sides to this country now, and everyone must simply ask themselves, Whose side are you on?
Number 8's withdrawn, so we go to Jonathan Edwards.
Diolch, Madam Deputy Speaker. Politics and big money are never happy bedfellows. First question any politician should ask if they are offered financial incentives or hospitality is, what do the providers want in return? Legislation in this field has always failed to make any meaningful impact on political corruption. The latest attempt, the 2014 Transparency of Lobbying Bill under the premiership of David Cameron, attempted to provide a narrative of propriety to decontaminate the Tory brand. In reality, had a hidden agenda which was to neuter the trade union movement. It pointed out at the time that the measures in the bill would not have dealt with any of the great Westminster corruption scandals of recent decades, namely donations for dinners, cash for honours, cash for questions, and the ministerial cab for hire of the last Labour government. Half a decade on, and Mr Cameron is himself embroiled in the latest great Westminster corruption scandal. These revelations raise all sorts of questions, yet again, about the incestuous and damaging relationship between big money and Westminster politics. I give a guarded welcome to the British government's decision to launch an inquiry into this case. However, I fear that Prime Minister's true intentions are to kick the issue into the long grass past the forthcoming elections and to settle a personal score against Mr Cameron. Any serious inquiry would surely have the wider remit of looking at how ministers have handled all COVID contracts, including investigating the NAO's concerns that the VIP list of suppliers were 10 times more likely to get a contract. And in that regard, Madam Deputy Speaker, I will be supporting the Labour motion later this afternoon. If Westminster is serious about addressing its tarnished reputation, then there must be deliberate moves to reduce the cost of politics. Americanisation of British politics has resulted in an expenditure arms race. Over recent decades, political parties have had to spend more of their time raising money to compete. If we are serious about addressing corruption in politics, then spending caps must be introduced for political parties, drastically reducing the cost of electioneering, with an added bonus of creating a more level playing field and a more plural politics. The wiser person than me once said, "Nothing in this life is free, all is pay in the end." Thus, I fully support calls to expand the statutory register of lobbyists to include those working in-house. The UK government must go further. The register of members' interest is an important innovation. However, currently the onus is on the electors to proactively search for information which should be readily available to them. New protocols could include requirements for BBC Parliament and Parliament TV to list details of members' interests on screen when individuals are making contributions. If there is no impropriety, why would anyone object? Slight mischievousness would even go as far as to recommend that members should be required to emblazon their private benefactors on their clothing, in the same way that snooker players proudly promote their sponsors on their waistcoats. I suspect such visual exposure might encourage restraint amongst those who use their roles in this House to harvest coin. I have long believed, Madam Deputy Speaker, that Westminster is beyond repair. The time has come for us in Wales to forge a different path, where we can create an honest political discourse based on the noble aspirations of public service, as opposed to the promotion of personal enrichment. Diolch yn fawr iawn.
Hugh Merriman.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed. I was just minded of the suggestion from the Honourable Member for Carmarthen East that we, like snooker players, and I perhaps I'm looking like one right now, we emblazon ourselves with any sponsors we may have had. I have absolutely nothing to declare as far as that's concerned, and having never received a penny apart from my very generous MP salary since I've been here. But I did want to take part in this debate because my real concern with this is that we, of course, with the local election coming up in May, are in danger of paying party politics in this chamber. And I shouldn't be naive, this is what this chamber is always about. But I will reflect that at the start of this week, this chamber was at its very best, and that's why, of course, I'm dressed as I am. We reference the Duke of Edinburgh, and we reference warmly how popular he was because he was direct, loyal and non-partisan. And here we are today talking about election leaflets and clearly playing party politics. But of course there is a very serious point behind this, and the point I really wish to make is really in defence of the current select committee process, of which I'm very fortunate indeed to be a chair of one of them. And I note that I sit alongside the chair of the Public and Constitutional Affairs Committee, that we will be in very safe hands when it comes to any inquiries that are needed and also any changes which have to be recommended. And I will make the point, because again, I don't think it's very well known, that select committees can now group together. We've done so for the COP26 scrutiny, so you have select committee chairs all the way across. We have it under the liaison committee, but we also have the ability to move members from one committee to another. So if there is a great requirement across the governmental department reviews, or indeed for Parliament to look at this matter, then of course it can be looked at because the structure is already in place. And I'll make the other point. This morning, when the Transport Select Committee met, it would be fair to say, including from the Minister who is before us, that it would be impossible to tell which party each MP came from, because we were all united as one in wanting one particular approach to be made. And to make a select committee more partisan with its sole aim and poisonous, I think will actually diminish the role of select committees and will diminish the role of scrutiny of this government, which of course I absolutely support, having always been a backbencher. What I also want to make clear, Madam Deputy Speaker, I know it's probably not very, it's not very political of me, or indeed it's a bit naive, but I'm also a firm believer in loyalty. I touched on it at the very start. I first came into being as an MP in 2015 under David Cameron. I found him to be an inspired leader, a genuine man, someone that really wanted the best for his country and for his party. He modernised our party. He took the country from a very, very desperate economic position that he'd inherited in 2010 and worked across the divide with the Liberal Democrats to try and make something better for the country. And he succeeded. If you look at the 1,000 jobs a day that he created, there was much he did well. But he was a genuine, sincere and very public-spirited man. And I know it may be naive of me to stand up and say this as a politician, because we tend to bury those that go before us. But actually, I think sometimes in life, loyalty is a good thing, remembering the virtues is a good thing, and perhaps not trying to bury those who are no longer here would actually serve us all as a House of Parliament in a much better manner than perhaps others seek to do. Thank you.
We now go to Kate Halern. We are actually going to Claire Coutinho.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I welcome the independent inquiry that is taking place and also the government's broader work on modernising procurement. I don't believe that anyone can say a new committee is needed, as proposed by the opposition today, when an independent inquiry is underway and when there already exists many committees, including the Committee on Standards in Public Life, which serve to scrutinise the work of former officials and ministers. A point that was well made by the chairman of the liaison committee, the Right Honourable Member for Harwich and North Essex, and also the member for Hazel Grove. However, the proposition that the opposition are putting forward today is not about securing an independent, legally minded expert in procurement to look into this matter. We already have that, and we should hear what he has to say. It is, I'm afraid, I think, a rather cynical and desperate attempt to prejudge an inquiry that's happening, and to also take this opportunity to make a party political attack. That's why the Honourable Member for Leeds West mentioned the 90s in her opening remarks quite persistently, but nothing about the period between 1997 and 2009, which is, of course, when we saw a long list of allegations about the Labour Party, from Eccleston to Cash for Honours, and of course the moniker of Tony's cronies when it came to public appointments. That's also why the member for Leeds West, when she put forward a list of supposedly crony contacts, included a Labour Party donor. And when she very much wanted us to secure PPE contracts, those contacts included a football agent company, a historical clothing company, and a legal practice. It's also why they don't want to wait for facts here, but will continue with, I think, a rather contemptible policy of smearing people in public life with scant regard for the truth or their reputation afterwards. It's what the opposition did with Kate Bingham, until it turned out she did an outstanding job on procuring vaccines for this country, a job which she was unpaid for, I might add. and I'm afraid received no apologies from the party opposite for their smears when they tried to label her as a crony, or indeed any thanks for her work on the vaccine task force. It's what they did with the race report, and they are yet to criticise the Labour MP who likened those educational experts and public servants who are trying to put forward solutions to improve inequality in this country to the Ku Klux Klan. It is desperate, Madam Deputy Speaker. It is desperate and I think quite cynical. This is, as people have rightly said today, a serious matter, and it's right that this matter is being looked into. And I think we should use the existing channels that we have to get to the facts. Thank you.
I do apologise. I hadn't been properly informed that 11, 12, 13 have all withdrawn. So we now go to Sarah Olney.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. The overriding impression that one has received from following every new revelation in the Greensill case is of people making up the rules to suit themselves. First, we have David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, who passed an anti-lobbying bill while he was Prime Minister, which conveniently didn't cover the kind of lobbying that he himself then went on to do. And now we find that the Cabinet Office didn't require its Chief Procurement Officer to declare his part-time role advising a commercial company that wanted to bid for public contracts, and then, incredibly, didn't require him to consult ACOBA about a full-time role with the same company when he left the civil service, because he was already working there. As a member of the Public Accounts Committee, I've attended a number of inquiries on the government's approach to the pandemic, and I've heard time and time again about the necessity of circumventing the rules in order to deliver at speed during the last 12 months. I broadly accept that principle, but again, we see that the people who are benefiting financially from these emergency provisions are close associates of those who decided that the rules could be circumvented. There often seems to be an aversion to setting rules in our political life. There seems to be a preference for assuming that a combination of personal honour and political pressure, or moral and reputational pressure, to quote the minister, are sufficient to keep people in line. There's a longer debate than my 4 minutes will allow to be had about whether our political culture has fundamentally changed to the extent that these principles can no longer be regarded as sufficient. But I think it suffices to say that the lack of a robust system of rules to which everyone is subjected and for which the penalties are more than just damage to political reputation is a major weakness of our constitution. If there are no rules, or if the rules are made and remade and applied by those in power, then there are no effective checks or balances on that power. If the rules can be easily changed or subverted to suit the circumstances, then they are not rules and they have no discernible function. For my own part, I think we are seeing a slippage of standards in public life. Our current Prime Minister has been sacked from 2 previous jobs for lying, and the former Prime Minister has been hawking his government connections for personal enrichment. I believe that the behaviour of our elected ministers has impacted our appointed officials' perception of what's acceptable. Doubtless the government will respond by saying that opposition parties have indulged in the same behaviour, that everyone is as bad as everyone else. And actually, that could well be true. At the heart of the government and parliamentary machinery are human beings, and not bad human beings for the most part, but any human being who is asked to define how conduct should be judged will naturally seek to define that conduct in terms that favour their own actions and judgment. So let us not argue that everyone is as bad as everyone else and that the only arbiter should be the voter. Or, if you do, accept that you're actually making the argument for a more robust system of rules. If everyone is dishonest, how can the voters use their votes to distinguish between them? And if the voters can't use their votes in this way, how can this be an effective check against self-interested behaviour? So I support the Labour Party's call for a select committee to investigate how Greensill became embedded into the government to the extent that it did, and to consider how these rules should be strengthened. Liberal Democrats supported the moves to bring in the lobbying register and rules to register ministerial meetings when we were in government. And we've previously tried to amend companies' legislation to require annual company spends on lobbying of up to £1,000 to be declared in annual accounts. We will consider any recommendations carefully and back anything that can improve the current system. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
Thank you. We now go to Ian Liddell-Granger.
Madam Deputy Speaker, thank you very much indeed, and I'm delighted to take part in this debate. This debate was called by the opposition, I suppose you could say, to smear the government by attacking a former Prime Minister. Lobbying certainly does need a proper investigation, and that is why I back the government's plan for a full inquiry. But this afternoon, Madam Deputy Speaker, I must tell the House a more disturbing true story about lobbying. In Somerset, of course, which I represent, a part of it, the County Council started lobbying the government for big change. They wanted to become a unitary council. They invested millions of pounds to run a campaign and found a receptive ear in the Secretary of State for Local Government. Of course, my right honourable friend, having the embarrassing experience of being lobbied, but I doubt if Somerset County Council ever stooped to taking money. They're not very good at hanging on to what they've got. Anyway, one bit of lobbying led quickly to government's decision to consider the idea for a Somerset unitary. Somerset County Council reckoned it would be a shoo-in. I'm afraid more fool them, because the County Council did not have the widespread support it claimed. The 4 district councils quickly devised an alternative, an infinitely better plan for reform, which they submitted quite rightly and lobbied the Secretary of State. The next stage was meant to be a full consultation to discover if either proposal could command, and I quote, a good deal of local support. This pathetic and meaningless phase can be interpreted by ministers, however they choose, or anyone else chooses. The method for measuring local support was decided by my right honourable friend. He chose an equally pathetic system of online questioning to lobby the local people, and anywhere in the world, people can fill it in, with no requirement at all for the people who live in Somerset to have preference. You can legally respond to this from Beijing or Moscow, as probably they regularly do. I'm sorry to say this is a confidence trick. The Secretary of State has also asked for views of a very limited number of organisations in Somerset. He's lobbied them. The districts begged him to extend the list in order to be fair. Nothing, of course, happened. And therefore, the 4 district councils decided to let him know that they would arrange a referendum with strict rules of participation to provide a meaningful addition to his consultation and lobbying. But instead of gracefully accepting the sensible suggestion, the Secretary of State has, I'm afraid, thrown a wobbly. He's written to all 4 district council leaders, rubbishing their idea and threatening them, Madam Deputy Speaker, with the law. I've never read such a cold response, and I'm sorry, it's not going to wash. The Secretary of State has turned lobbying on its head. He appears to be using a big stick for those that have different ideas to uphold democracy and fairness. I will tell him straight and publicly right now, these actions should, must, and will fail. The district councils represent all the parties that we know, except obviously the SNP, and they are united against this. The referendum will go ahead, and if they use the law to stop it, then I'm afraid lobbying has got a very much more sinister and nasty feel to it than this case. And I would urge anybody in Somerset to lobby to make sure that we have the voice of the people for the democracy they deserve. Now, Madam Deputy Speaker, as I could say to the Secretary of State, see you in court or come up and sue me sometime. Thank you.
We now go to Dame Angela Eagle.
Thank you very much, Madam Deputy Speaker. After 11 years in power, this Tory government has ended up, like all Tory governments end up, mired in sleaze. But what is different about the scandal confronting us today is the sheer scale of the larceny being practised on the public purse by the donors, friends and beneficiaries of the Tory party. The Greensill scandal, which is egregious and shocking, is only the tip of a very large iceberg. We have seen £2 billion of pandemic procurement contracts given without competition to companies which have donated money directly to the Tory party. VIP procurement line specifically designed for Tory mates, and if you're the health secretary, your local pub landlord. A clutch of senior government appointments awarded directly and without competition to relatives of serving Tory ministers, and now the announcement of a laughably described independent inquiry into the Greensill scandal led by the son of a former Tory cabinet minister, a man who sits on the board of the business department, which is responsible for the British Business Bank, which gave Greensill Capital access to hundreds of millions of pounds of taxpayers' money. Madam Deputy Speaker, this is just not good enough. We urgently need an inquiry which has the power to call for witnesses and papers, take evidence in public, and publish its findings. There are many questions we need answers to. Why was David Cameron allowed by serving cabinet ministers to lobby so ferociously in his own personal financial interest? And why was Greensill given such untrammelled access to senior civil servants at the height of the pandemic? How did the Chancellor push the team to be more accommodating to Greensill Capital? Why was Greensill, an unregulated shadow bank with a toxic business model, allowed access to the coronavirus large business interruption loan scheme? Was this pushed by ministers, senior bank officials, or civil servants? If so, at whose request? Did Greensill then exceed its lending authority and put even more taxpayers' money at risk? Why was Lex Greensill allowed to roam so freely across Whitehall, pushing his financial chicanery? And why on this earth was the government's senior procurement official responsible for £40 billion of public contracts allowed by Cabinet Office to work part-time for Greensill whilst he was still in the civil service? Madam Deputy Speaker, the stench is growing. Only the disinfectant of a fully transparent and independent inquiry will deal with it. And that is what the motion before us today would create. If Tory members opposite vote this motion down today, as they have the power to do, they should know that they will be voting to try and brush this scandal under the carpet and treating British taxpayers with contempt.
Craig Williams.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's a privilege to rise in this debate, and I have to say to the House that I was tempted to, after the opening statement from the other side, to go straight into a political attack on pointing out my opinion of the failures of the Welsh Labour government after 22 years, not to have a lobbying register, to list the number of public bodies in Wales that are led by former Labour Assembly members, to list the number of bodies that are led by former Labour MPs' partners, to list the former special advisers. But actually that will add nothing to public discourse. That will not help this issue. I was quite moved by the chairman of the Packet Committee, my honourable friend for Hazel Grove, and what he said about his select committee. And I can attest, as I'm sure every member of both sides, that the chairman of that select committee will do no favours for the whips and do no favours for the government. That will be a robust select committee. And I really do think, as the chairman of the Transport Select Committee said, that our select committees in this House are robust. The membership, I think, is beyond reproach. And this debate today, and I did jest with the chairman of the select committee of whether it was a vote of no confidence in himself. But this debate today really does not add anything to this. My honourable friend, the Weston-super-Mare, raised three pertinent questions, and there are some serious questions around this issue. I welcome the inquiry, I welcome the minister's tone. But I will say, because I don't want to asperge the many former Labour Assembly members that chair health boards that are on the sports body, and you know what, they have a lot to give for public life. Many of them are doing an excellent job, and I welcome their positions after frontline politics, and I support a lot of them. But this debate, it is tempting for people on both sides to start churlish comments about cronyism. It is very tempting, and we have heard from other members, Madam Deputy Speaker, of saying just because of somebody's political affiliation. I would love to see more former Conservatives, of course, in public life appointed to bodies in Wales. I can see perhaps not as many as Labour because they have been government for 22 years, so their contact books are a lot easier, I'm sure, to contact friends. But that does not take anything from what they are doing in public life in Wales. So I will sit down, but all I will say is echo what the chairman of the Packet Committee had said, and that is not to look at our select committee process and say that's not independent enough. That will do nothing for it. is to get behind this inquiry. If you're unhappy with the inquiry, go through the select committees already in place that have the powers, and we all have members on those select committees, and there are avenues open to the parties in this House to take up these serious concerns already there. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, I'll give the minute back, but thank you very much.
We now go to Richard Bergen.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. And the scandal of the former Prime Minister lobbying the government for his new boss has rightly captured the headlines. And I have to say that the attempts of some of the Tory MPs to ride the high horse in this debate really is quite rich, because the rot actually runs much deeper. The whole system is rigged in the interest of the super rich, and the super rich spend a lot of money making sure that it stays that way. And in the Tory party, they have the perfect vehicle for this. The pandemic has cast more light on very questionable practices. While it's 37 pence benefits increases, wage cuts for millions of public sector workers and tax rises for millions, some, on the other hand, have had a very good pandemic indeed. Vast sums handed over to Circa and the like, funds that should have gone to our National Health Service. Companies with connections to top Tories 10 times more likely to get COVID contracts than those without such connections. The Health Secretary's mate, the landlord of his former local pub, winning a COVID test contract worth a small fortune. I could go on. Instead, I'll quote the words of the former government chief scientist, David King, who said the process of distributing public money to private companies during this pandemic, and I quote, really smells of corruption. But it's not just in a crisis that the Conservatives look to enrich the super rich. There's a housing minister acting unlawfully over £1 billion property deal that helped the developer avoid tens of millions of local council charges. He got his approval from the Conservative government and 2 weeks later donated £12,000 to the Conservative Party. And what about the Tory MPs raking in small fortunes on top of their salary, as if being an MP isn't a full-time job, making many thousands of pounds doing private consultancy work on a second job during this pandemic? It's shameful, and frankly, it should be banned. Madam Deputy Speaker, 1 in 3 of the UK billionaires have bankrolled the Conservative Party since 2005. 1 in 3 of the UK's billionaires. And boy, do they get their money's worth. Tens of billions of pounds in corporate giveaways for the rich from the party opposite. And so I'll end on the words of David Cameron, himself something of an authority on these matters. This is what he had to say. We all know how it works. The lunches, the hospitality, the quiet word in your ear, the ex-ministers and ex-advisors for hire, helping big business find the right way to get its way. Madam Deputy Speaker, the stench of corruption has grown ever stronger through this crisis. And people across the country are quite rightly fed up to the back teeth of it. People are sick of it. It needs to be stamped out before it does untold damage to our democracy.
We now go to Julie Marson.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. It's interesting to follow the member for Leeds East. And I think he perhaps illustrates the problem for his party in talking about a serious issue with serious implications, particularly when he talks about the high horse. Because I, for one, find it impossible to take lectures from him or his party, from members opposite who have either served or evangelised for either a Labour leader who was famously a pretty straight kind of guy, whilst exempting Bernie Ecclestone's Formula One from a tobacco advertising ban after a tidy £1 million donation, and has had, shall we say, some pretty profitable gigs since leaving office. All they wanted for Prime Minister, the member for Islington North, who was present but not involved in laying wreaths for Munich terrorists, and presided over an unlawfully anti-Semitic party. And that's without mentioning Labour's cronyism union donations, and the fact that the Shadow Defence Secretary lobbied for Greensill. So as Ted Hastings also said, you've got a nerve, fella. But on the substance of the motion, I absolutely commend the remarks of the Honourable Member for Norwich North, the Minister, who details the actions the government is taking, and also the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove with the activities of his select committee. So in response to serious questions on this issue, the government is acting, has acted quickly, going above and beyond, for example, the information required by the Freedom of Information Act. And I really welcome its commissioning of the independent Boardman review, which will thoroughly and transparently investigate the issues around Greensill. And that's in addition to the British Business Bank review of Greensill's compliance with the CL Bills scheme. And I think it's really regrettable that the members opposite seek to disparage and discredit that independent review. I welcome the fact that the government's been clear that Greensill's requests were either turned down or that no ministers were involved in gaining access to corona support loans. So, Madam Deputy Speaker, the government has answered. It is answering legitimate questions and legitimate concerns, and it's entirely right and proper for the government to be transparent and accountable. We all want that. It's giving a serious response to serious questions. And at the same time, it's getting on with the serious job of supporting people and businesses through a global pandemic. Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker.
We now go to Karen Smith.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. The Greensill debacle is, in the truest sense of the word, unbelievable. It's unbelievable that David Cameron was able to lobby in such a way with such impunity. Unbelievable that cabinet ministers were able to engage so freely with him. Unbelievably that millions upon millions of public money was bound up in contracts connected with more than one Cameron client. And most of all, unbelievable at all, it would seem that at this point of time, no actual rules were broken. And it does speak to a system that it's lost its way. The former Prime Minister's lost his moral compass, and a general public has every right to lose faith in what they had left of this government, because from the top to the bottom, this government are thumbing their noses at the people and institutions they are meant to serve, all the while enabled and protected by the rules, regulations and legislation they brought in. And instead of accountability, the once vaunted disinfectant of sunlight, we have deals done over tawdry text messages in darkened bars, and bizarrely, in front of those lavish lights, fires, due process has been damned. Now, I'm proud to have worked in public service, and I'm old enough to remember the last lot of sleaze from the Tory government. And I'm a firm supporter of those Nolan principles of selflessness, integrity, objectivity, accountability, openness, honesty, and leadership. Now, Nolan applies to anyone who works as a public office holder, and we do have thousands of decent, public-minded people across government and the public and private sector who wish to see this country do better. And that is our task today, because what we are learning goes too wide to be confined to be a quick review by the Prime Minister's nominee. For example, the issues around the NHS do require much more sunlight. Well before the pandemic in 2018, we had the episode with Babylon. We had a Secretary of State who clearly didn't see the NHS and its public institutions as doing well enough and started to skirt process. The appointment of Dido Harding totally hands afoot about Public Health England, a new super body, again about which we know little, to be headed by the Prime Minister's friend. It is time to call a halt. Now, we also see Mr. Greensill Company get into the NHS to use the NHS name, a trusted reputation, to allow staff who can't wait for payday to get paid earlier. Now, frankly, if the Secretary of State supported the NHS and paid them properly, then Mr. Greensill wouldn't have yet another money-making scheme on the back of NHS staff. Now, I'm a proud member of the Public Administration and Constitutional Affairs Committee, and I do commend the comments earlier of our chair, the Honourable Member for Hazel Grove. We are ready to serve. We've just completed 3 COVID-19 reports, and all 3 reports highlight that the governance arrangements have not been clear and that senior accountability has not been clear. They are damning reports. There is a lack of clarity over the role of the Cabinet Office, COVID committees, and the Quad in decision-making over the COVID crisis. There is lack of clarity over ministerial responsibility, particularly the role of the Chancellor of the Duchy of Lancaster. Now, the scrutiny of COVID inquiry also highlighted issues with intergovernmental relations across the devolved administration. On top of the dreadful loss of life, damage to our economy, and so much of our life disrupted, people have made great sacrifices. Now, we are clear on the committee that any review of the Cabinet Office response to COVID-19 should include examination of the governance arrangements, including COBRA, the C19 daily meetings, and the Quad and Cabinet committees. It is opaque. We have struggled on the committee to get the appropriate Cabinet Minister in front of us, in front of the committee, and to respond properly, but we will persevere.
Mark Fletcher.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. I think as we operate in these COVID times, we have an unusual setup and we watch many members from afar. And I have to say that for those of us who've dreamed of sitting on these green benches and the responsibility and honour that you have to live by and uphold when you sit on these green benches, I do wonder whether some of the contributions that have come from our screens today would have been made if the people were in this room, because it feels to me like some of the things that I've witnessed whilst I've been sat here from the screens have been horribly misjudged. And the reason for that is that I think there would be a general agreement that some of the headlines in recent weeks have raised eyebrows. And I think that there is a level of concern that is shared across the House. But I think, unfortunately, the opposition, and in particular the members that I've been watching on the screen, have decided to run with this in a way that is deeply unhelpful and doesn't help to solve any of the problems that they are highlighting. And actually, I therefore fear that this is much more about party political posturing than it is about clearing up the system. And I would urge the front bench, the opposition front bench, to consider that and to think of ways in which we can work together to improve this system. And I have to say, I listened to the tremendous contributions to the honourable member for Montgomeryshire and for Weston-super-Mare, and I thought that they had an adult tone and gave something that was deeply needed in this speech, which was perspective. And I think I commend both of them, but more so I commend the member for Hazel Grove, who I thought sort of answered the opposition's point rather succinctly and did the minister's job for her, insofar as saying that what you are calling for in this motion today already exists. The concerns that have been raised are also being independently investigated, and I think that that is what the public would expect to see. And so again, I come back to a fear that what we are debating today is merely party political posturing, and we should be doing better than that. But I would add at the end a note of caution, which is that we as MPs are exposed to an awful lot of things, an awful lot of voices within our constituency, and that is right. So we meet many charities, we meet many individuals and constituents, we meet many community groups, we meet many councillors, and yes, we meet many businesses. And those conversations help us to know more. They help us to empathise, they help us to understand. And I think that is an incredibly important part of our job. And I think that there is always a concern when this sort of a series of events comes to the surface, that the first thing we should do is to stop doing that, to stop meeting people, to stop hearing other concerns, and to stop hearing the concerns of business. And I think that would be a very unfortunate development, because I have worked with partners across the East Midlands on our Freeport bid, and one of the strengths of that bid has been the fact that we have had academics and businesses and our local enterprise partnership and our county councils and MPs working together in unison. And that sort of behaviour is what is needed to affect change in areas like the East Midlands. And if we end up in a situation in which we put up too many barriers, I agree that we should have transparency, but not barriers. And it is important that we continue to have conversations with all groups so that we can make ourselves better informed. And that is even more true if you happen to be in a position which doesn't allow you to more freely meet with your constituents, like ministers.
I am attempting to get everybody in, but it does mean that after the next speaker, I'll reduce the time limit to 3 minutes. Sam Tarry.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker. We've heard many contributions from across this House today, and I'm frankly disappointed that really what's been said is almost making an absolute mockery of democracy. The general public out there at the moment will be seeing not Parliament and government at its best, but instead a revolving door of sleaze. As we've seen time and time again, the government has been rotten in its dealings. Every few weeks, a new shady deal emerges that reeks of cronyism and corruption. Let's just be clear here about what we're talking about. Just in the past 12 months alone, we've seen what this government truly stands for. Back-channel conversations, multi-million-pound contracts awarded with alarming regularity to chums in the city with little or no scrutiny. Let's start with the Health Secretary, who handed out a £30 million contract to his former neighbour and pub landlord Alex Bourne, a man with no prior experience of producing medical supplies and whose company Hinpack was at the time producing plastic cups and takeaway boxes for the catering industry. And despite that, the Health Secretary saw fit to issue a multi-million-pound contract to that company and put our nation's health in the hands of this company by allowing them to produce millions of vials for the NHS COVID tests. And this didn't come about through a formal tender and procurement process. All that was required, I might remind this House, Madam Deputy Speaker, was the Health Secretary's own admission was a WhatsApp message. Let's move on to the Housing Secretary, who last summer admitted apparent bias in reversing a planning decision against Tory donor Richard Desmond's proposed West Ferry Printworks housing development, overruling local officials, saving the property developer an estimated £45 million. Mr Desmond later donated, surprise, surprise, £12,000 to the Conservative Party just weeks after sitting next to the Housing Secretary at a Tory fundraiser. And then, Madam Deputy Speaker, there's the Prime Minister himself, who was also up to his eyeballs in the murky world of lobbying, with his former lover, Jennifer Arcuri's firm Innotech, awarded £26,000 of taxpayers' money whilst he was the Mayor of London. Unsurprisingly, that scandal was also whitewashed by this government. And now we have former Prime Minister David Cameron, who knew very well what he was doing when he started lobbying for Greensill Capital. Indeed, we've heard from the Honourable Member for Leeds East his full comments, but we must also remind ourselves that he also said the next big scandal was exactly this type of thing waiting to happen. Despite this, Mr Cameron saw it fit to conveniently forget his own advice when he stood to make a £60 million after setting up a cosy drink with the Health Secretary, sending a string of private messages to the Chancellor and in the process helping those two Cabinet members commit at least 3 possible breaches of the ministerial code. It seems then absolutely right that the former member for Bolsover, who sadly missed in this House, called David Cameron Mr Dodgy Dave in 2016 because he was dodgy then and he's dodgy now. None of this will be taken seriously by our current Prime Minister, who just days ago revealed what he really thinks about the role of big business in helping to oil the wheels of this government when he said, the reason we have the vaccine success is because of capitalism and because of greed. Madam Deputy Speaker, the members opposite really are the Gordon Geckos of the Green benches who believe to their very core that greed is good. And as a former Conservative minister himself told The Guardian, a little bit of money goes a long way. Well, it's time for that culture to stop. Madam Deputy Speaker, what there now needs to be is a Parliament-led cross-party inquiry formed by a new select committee to investigate the Greensill lobbying scandal, which could have power to compel witnesses, give evidence and restore what we need in this country, integrity to our democracy, and end the grip of corporate spivs and spinners once and for all.
Lee Rowley.
Thank you, Madam Deputy Speaker, and thank you for the opportunity.